Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. The Thompson family had always dreamed of a fresh start, and the sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Blackwood, Maine, seemed like the perfect opportunity. It was the summer of 1983 when they packed up their lives in the bustling city and headed for the quiet, tree-lined roads of the countryside. The house, known locally as Blackwood Manor, had been abandoned for decades, its faded grandeur and ivy-covered walls giving it an air of mystery. The real estate agent had been eager to sell, offering it at a price too good to resist, and though the town's residents whispered warnings about its dark past, the Thompsons dismissed them as mere superstition. The drive to Blackwood was long and winding, the roads narrowing as they left civilization behind. The mansion came into view suddenly, its tall turrets and pointed gables looming against the gray sky. The children, Emily and Michael, pressed their faces against the car windows, awed by its size but unnerved by its appearance. The air around the property felt heavier, the surrounding woods eerily silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. John Thompson, the father, stepped out of the car first, his footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway, while his wife, Sarah, lingered behind, clutching her sweater tighter against the unexpected chill. The front door creaked open with a groan, revealing a grand foyer covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its intricate patterns peeling at the edges, and a massive chandelier hung above, its crystals dull and lifeless. The scent of mildew and something vaguely metallic hung in the air, though none of them could pinpoint its source. Emily, the youngest at 10 years old, clung to her mother's side, her wide eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting something to move. Michael, 13 and trying to appear brave, ventured further inside, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. The house was a labyrinth of rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. The living room featured a towering fireplace, its hearth filled with ashes that seemed too fresh for a house abandoned for so long. The dining room had a long, ornate table, its surface scarred with deep grooves that looked like claw marks. Upstairs, the bedrooms were spacious but suffocating, their windows covered in heavy drapes that blocked out the sunlight. Emily's room, assigned to her by her parents, had a large, ornate mirror that seemed to reflect the room in a way that made her feel as though she was being watched. As the family began unpacking, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. Sarah tried to lighten the mood by humming a tune, but her voice seemed swallowed by the walls, leaving an even deeper silence in its wake. John busied himself with inspecting the house's structure, though he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him from the shadows. By evening, the family gathered in the kitchen, which was surprisingly intact compared to the rest of the house. They ate a simple meal by the light of a single bulb, the hum of the refrigerator their only companion. Emily, usually talkative, was quiet, her eyes darting toward the doorway every few seconds. Michael teased her about being scared, but even he couldn't ignore the unease that had settled over them all. When the sun finally set, plunging the house into darkness, the family retreated to their rooms, each one carrying a flashlight as if they were children camping in the woods. The first night in Blackwood Manor was restless. Emily woke up several times, convinced she had heard whispers coming from the walls. Michael, in the room next to hers, heard something scratching at his door, though when he opened it, there was nothing there. Sarah and John, lying in bed, exchanged uneasy glances as the house seemed to come alive around the moans and creaks that couldn't be dismissed as the settling of an old building. By morning, the family was exhausted, though none of them dared to voice their fears aloud. The next day brought a sense of normalcy, or at least the illusion of it. The Thompsons spent hours cleaning and unpacking, trying to make the house feel like a home. Sarah discovered a garden in the backyard, its once manicured flower beds now overgrown with weeds and thorny vines. She made a mental note to revive it, though the thought of spending too much time outside made her uneasy. John, ever the handyman, began repairing the broken floorboards and leaky faucets, though every tool he touched felt heavier, as if the house was resisting his efforts. Emily found herself drawn to the library, a dusty room filled with shelves of ancient books and a large, ornate desk. She ran her fingers over the spines, her curiosity outweighing her fear, and pulled out a book at random. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. As she flipped through it, she stumbled upon illustrations of strange symbols and rituals, their meanings unknown but deeply unsettling. She quickly closed the book and shoved it back on the shelf, though the images lingered in her mind. Michael, meanwhile, explored the attic, the one place in the house he had yet to see. The narrow staircase creaked under his weight as he climbed, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was filled with old furniture, trunks of moth-eaten clothing, and a collection of dolls with cracked faces and empty eyes. At the far end of the room, he found a large, dusty mirror, its surface reflecting his pale face back at him. For a moment, he thought he saw something move behind him, but when he turned, the attic was empty. The days passed in a blur of activity, though the sense of unease never faded. The house seemed to resist their attempts to make it a home, its oppressive atmosphere growing heavier with each passing hour. The Thompsons found themselves avoiding certain rooms, the library and the attic in particular, as if the spaces themselves were alive and watching. At night, the whispers grew louder, the creaks more purposeful, and though they tried to ignore it, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. One evening, during dinner, a sudden knock on the door shattered the fragile peace. The family froze, their forks hovering mid-air, as the sound echoed through the house. John, the first to recover, stood up and walked to the door, though a part of him hesitated. When he opened it, there was no one there, just the empty porch and the darkening sky. As he closed the door, he noticed a small, weathered journal lying on the doorstep. Its cover was etched with the name Jeremiah Blackwood, and though John didn't know it yet, the secrets within would change everything. That night, the house seemed more alive than ever. The whispers turned into voices, the creaks into footsteps, and the shadows into forms that moved just beyond the edge of sight. Emily woke up screaming, her bedroom mirror reflecting a figure that wasn't her own. Michael locked his door, his bravado shattered by the sound of something scratching at the wood. Sarah and John huddled together in their bed, the weight of the house pressing down on them like a physical force. In the library, the book Emily had found earlier lay open on the desk, its pages filled with symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. By morning, the Thompsons were exhausted, their faces pale and their eyes haunted. They sat together at the breakfast table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. John opened Jeremiah Blackwood's journal, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. The entries were filled with descriptions of rituals, sacrifices, and a pact with something beyond human comprehension. The last entry was dated the night Jeremiah and his family disappeared without a trace. As John closed the journal, he realized that their dream of a fresh start had turned into a nightmare they might never escape. The mansion, with its towering walls and shadowy corners, had claimed them. The whispers, the movements, the oppressive silence, it was all part of the cycle, a cycle that had begun decades ago and would continue until the house claimed what it needed. The Thompsons had wanted a fresh start, but they had instead walked into a trap, one that would force them to confront the horrors of Blackwood Manor and the dark legacy of the family who had lived there before them. The days in Blackwood Manor blurred together, each one marked by the same oppressive atmosphere that clung to the house like a second skin. The Thompsons tried to settle in, unpacking their belongings and arranging furniture, but no matter what they did, the house refused to feel like a home. Strange things began to happen, objects disappearing only to reappear in odd places, doors creaking open on their own, and the sound of footsteps echoing in empty rooms. The family tried to rationalize it, attributing the disturbances to the house's age and disrepair, but deep down, they all felt it. The house was alive. Emily was the first to hear the whispers. It started on her third night in the mansion, just as she was drifting off to sleep. At first, she thought it was the wind rustling the trees outside her window, but as the sounds grew clearer, she realized they were voices, soft, indistinct, and impossibly close. She pulled the covers over her head, her heart pounding in her chest, and tried to convince herself it was her imagination. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they filled the room like a chant she couldn't understand. By morning, she was exhausted, her eyes sunken and her face pale. When Emily told her parents about the whispers, they exchanged a worried glance but tried to reassure her. "It's probably just the house settling," John said, though his voice lacked conviction. Sarah offered to stay with her that night, but Emily refused, not wanting to seem childish. That evening, as the family gathered in the dimly lit kitchen for dinner, the tension was palpable. Michael, usually eager to tease his sister, was quiet, his eyes darting toward the shadows as if he, too, had heard something he couldn't explain. That night, the whispers returned, but this time, they weren't confined to Emily's room. John and Sarah lay in bed, the silence of the house broken by the faint but unmistakable sound of voices. They spoke in a language neither of them understood, their tones alternating between soothing and menacing. Sarah gripped John's arm, her nails digging into his skin, as the whispers seemed to crawl into their minds, repeating phrases that felt both foreign and eerily familiar. When the noises finally subsided, neither of them could sleep, their eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling. Michael, too, heard the whispers, though he would never admit it. From his room in the attic, the voices seemed to come from the walls themselves, a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. He told himself it was just the wind or the house's old plumbing, but when he pressed his ear to the wall, the whispers grew clearer, their urgency impossible to ignore. One voice stood out among the others, a woman's voice, soft but commanding, calling his name over and over. He spent the rest of the night with the lights on, clutching a baseball bat and staring at the door. By the third night, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. They followed the family wherever they went, filling the halls with their eerie cadence. The Thompsons began avoiding certain parts of the house, the library and the dining room in particular, where the voices seemed loudest. The once grand spaces now felt like traps, their shadows hiding things that shouldn't be there. Even during the day, when sunlight streamed through the windows, the presence of the whispers lingered, a constant reminder that they were not alone. One afternoon, while exploring the house, Emily found herself drawn to the library. The whispers were quieter here, but the air felt heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She ran her fingers over the spines of the dusty books, her eyes lingering on the one she had discovered days earlier. The symbols on its cover seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and though she tried to resist, she found herself opening it. The pages were filled with illustrations of strange rituals and cryptic texts, their meanings unclear but deeply unsettling. She felt the whispers grow louder as she flipped through the pages, their voices urging her to keep reading. That night, the whispers took on a new intensity, their voices morphing into something more tangible. Emily woke to the sound of her name being called, not in her head but out loud, as if someone was standing at the foot of her bed. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat, and saw a figure in the corner of the room, a woman in a black dress, her face obscured by shadows. The woman beckoned to her, her voice soft and soothing, but Emily felt no comfort. She screamed, and the figure vanished, leaving the room in silence. John and Sarah rushed to her side, their faces pale and drawn. Emily tried to explain what she had seen, but her words came out in a jumbled mess. Sarah held her tightly, rocking her back and forth, while John stood by the door, his fists clenched. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices overlapping into a cacophony of sounds that made it impossible to think. John shouted for them to stop, his voice echoing through the house, but the whispers only grew louder, their tones mocking and cruel. The next day, the Thompsons debated leaving the house, but the thought of abandoning their investment held them back. They called a local handyman to fix the creaky floorboards and leaky pipes, hoping that repairing the house would silence its ghosts. The man, an elderly local named Mr. Hargrove, arrived with a toolbox and a quiet demeanor. As he worked, he glanced around nervously, his eyes lingering on the library and the attic. When John asked him if he knew anything about the house's history, Mr. Hargrove hesitated before muttering, "Blackwood Manor has a way of holding onto its secrets." That evening, as the family tried to distract themselves with a game of cards, the whispers returned, their voices more distinct than ever. This time, they spoke in English, their words clear and chilling. "You belong to us," they said, over and over, their voices rising in a crescendo that made the walls shake. Michael dropped his cards and ran upstairs, slamming his bedroom door behind him. Emily buried her face in her mother's lap, tears streaming down her cheeks, while John paced the room, his frustration and fear boiling over. The whispers grew bolder, their presence felt even in the daylight. The family began to notice strange symbols etched into the walls, their patterns resembling the ones in the book Emily had found. The air in the house grew colder, the shadows darker, and the whispers more insistent. The Thompsons felt as though they were being watched, their every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison, its walls closing in around them. One night, as John sat in the study, he heard a new sound among the whispers, a child's laughter, distant and haunting. He followed the sound to the hallway, where he found Emily standing at the foot of the stairs, her back to him. She turned slowly, her face pale and her eyes glassy, and whispered, "They want to play." Before John could react, she collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing as the whispers filled the air. John screamed for Sarah, his voice drowned out by the cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time Sarah arrived, Emily was unconscious, her breathing shallow and her skin cold. The whispers subsided, leaving the house in an eerie silence. The Thompsons carried Emily to the couch, their hands trembling as they covered her with a blanket. Sarah held her daughter's hand, tears streaming down her face, while John dialed the nearest hospital. But as he waited for the line to connect, he heard the whispers again, their voices soft but insistent. "She is ours now," they said, their words sending a chill down his spine. The morning after Emily's collapse, the Thompsons awoke to an eerie silence. The whispers that had haunted them for days were gone, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural and heavy. Emily lay on the couch, her face pale but peaceful, as if she were merely sleeping. John and Sarah watched over her, their exhaustion etched into the dark circles under their eyes. They debated calling a doctor, but something held them back, a fear that whatever was happening to their daughter couldn't be explained by modern medicine. The house, with its Gothic spires and shadowed corners, seemed to be waiting, biding its time before unleashing its next horror. As the family tried to regain a sense of normalcy, Sarah's attention was drawn to the large portrait that hung in the living room. It depicted Eleanor Blackwood, the mansion's original mistress, her face serene and her eyes piercing. Sarah had noticed it before, but had never paid it much attention. Now, as she stood before it, she felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. The woman in the portrait seemed alive, her eyes following Sarah as she moved across the room. She tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to fatigue, but the unease lingered. John, meanwhile, busied himself with inspecting the house's deteriorating structure. The mansion's age was showing, its walls cracking and its floors sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was resisting his efforts. Tools went missing, nails bent as he hammered them, and the air in the rooms he entered grew colder, as if the house itself was rejecting his presence. He found himself glancing over his shoulder more often, the sensation of being watched growing harder to ignore. By midday, Emily stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She looked around the room, confused and disoriented, before her gaze settled on the portrait of Eleanor. Her eyes widened and she whispered, "She was here last night." Sarah knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her daughter's forehead, and asked what she meant. Emily hesitated before describing the woman in the black dress who had visited her in her sleep. "She told me I belong here," Emily said, her voice trembling. John and Sarah exchanged a worried glance, their fear deepening. The portrait became a focal point for the family's growing dread. Emily refused to enter the living room, her small body shaking whenever she caught a glimpse of it. Michael, though he tried to act unfazed, began avoiding the room as well, claiming the painting gave him bad vibes. Sarah found herself drawn to it, her curiosity overpowering her fear. She studied the portrait closely, noticing details she hadn't before. The faint smile on Eleanor's lips, the intricate patterns on her dress, and the odd symbols etched into the frame. The more she looked, the more she felt as though the painting was trying to tell her something. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah discovered something that made her blood run cold. She was cleaning the living room when she noticed that the portrait had changed. Eleanor's expression, once serene, was now twisted into a cruel smile, her eyes gleaming with malice. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing, and called for John. When he arrived, the portrait was back to its original state, Eleanor's face calm and composed. John suggested it was a trick of the light, but Sarah knew better. The house was playing with them. That night, the family was awakened by a sound that sent chills down their spines. Laughter, soft and melodic, echoing through the halls. It came from the living room, drawing them like moths to a flame. They gathered at the doorway, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls, and froze when they saw the portrait. Eleanor's face was alive, her lips moving as she laughed, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The Thompsons watched in horror as the painting shifted, the once still image now dynamic and alive. Emily screamed, and the laughter stopped, leaving the house in silence. The next morning, the Thompsons found the portrait back to normal, its surface smooth and unchanging. But the damage had been done. The image of Eleanor's twisted face was burned into their minds. John decided it was time to take action. He removed the painting from the wall, intending to store it in the attic, but as he carried it up the stairs, the frame grew heavier, as if the portrait itself was resisting. When he reached the attic, he placed it in a corner and covered it with a sheet, though he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching him. Despite their efforts, the portrait's presence lingered in the house. Emily claimed she could still hear Eleanor's laughter, her voice soft but insistent. Michael began having nightmares, his dreams filled with images of the painting coming to life. Sarah found herself drawn to the attic, her feet moving instinctively toward the covered portrait. She would stand before it, her hand hovering over the sheet, before forcing herself to leave. The painting had become a symbol of the house's malevolence, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that surrounded them. One afternoon, as John searched for answers, he found himself in the library. The book Emily had discovered days earlier lay open on the desk, its pages filled with symbols and rituals. One page, marked with a red stain, described a binding ritual used to trap a spirit within an object. John's hands trembled as he read the text, his mind racing with possibilities. Could Eleanor's spirit be bound to the portrait? And if so, how had she gained the power to affect the living? He closed the book, his thoughts a jumble of fear and desperation. That night, the house grew restless. The whispers returned, their voices louder and more urgent, and the air grew colder, frost forming on the windows. The Thompsons huddled together in the living room, their fear palpable. Emily pointed to the empty space where the portrait had hung and whispered, "She's coming." The family watched in horror as the shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into the form of a woman in a black dress. Eleanor's laughter filled the air, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. John grabbed a flashlight and shone it at the figure, but the light passed through her as if she were made of smoke. Sarah clutched her children, her body trembling, as Eleanor's form drifted closer. Her voice, soft and mocking, echoed through the room. "You cannot escape," she said, her words sending chills down their spines. The family felt a wave of despair wash over them, their hope fading as the spirit's presence grew stronger. In a desperate attempt to protect his family, John grabbed a heavy candlestick and charged at the figure. His hand passed through her, and the candlestick fell to the floor with a loud crash. Eleanor's laughter grew louder, her form dissolving into a cloud of smoke that filled the room. The Thompsons coughed and gasped for air, their vision blurred as the smoke enveloped them. When it cleared, the room was empty, but the damage had been done. The family felt broken, their will to fight slipping away. The next morning, the Thompsons awoke to find the portrait back on the wall, its surface unchanged, but its presence more oppressive than ever. The house felt darker, its shadows deeper, and the whispers louder. The family knew they were running out of time. Eleanor's hold on the house was growing stronger, and her influence on them more profound. They had tried to fight, but the mansion had other plans, its malevolence impossible to escape. By evening, Emily began to act strangely. Her once bright eyes were now dull and distant, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't her own. She stood before the portrait, her small hand reaching out to touch the frame, and whispered, "She wants me to stay." Sarah pulled her daughter away, tears streaming down her face, but the damage had been done. Emily was changing, her connection to Eleanor growing stronger with each passing moment. The Thompsons knew they had to make a decision: stay and fight a battle they couldn't win, or leave and risk losing Emily forever. The house, with its Gothic spires and shadowed halls, had become a prison, its malevolent presence impossible to escape. As they stood in the living room, the portrait of Eleanor watching them with her serene yet menacing gaze, they realized the truth. They were trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. The following morning, Thompsons awoke to a sense of foreboding so thick it felt like a physical weight on their chests. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood still hung in the living room, its gaze piercing and inescapable, as if it were daring them to remove it again. John, spurred by desperation, decided to search the house for answers. He started in the library, where the strange book of rituals lay open on the desk, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and dark incantations. He flipped through it, his hands trembling, but the text offered no solutions, only more questions. As John rifled through the library's shelves, he noticed a loose panel in the wall near the fireplace. His heart pounded as he pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment filled with dust and cobwebs. Inside, he found a leather-bound journal, its cover worn with age and stained with what looked like dried blood. The name, Jeremiah Blackwood, was etched into the leather in faded ink. John hesitated before opening it, a chill running down his spine as he felt a sudden shift in the air, as if the house itself was warning him not to proceed. The diary's first pages were filled with mundane entries, descriptions of Jeremiah's daily life, his work, and his family. But as John read further, the tone changed. Jeremiah wrote of strange occurrences in the house, of whispers in the night and shadows that moved on their own. He described his growing obsession with the occult, driven by a desire for power and wealth. The entries became darker, detailing rituals he had performed in the mansion's hidden basement, sacrifices made in the name of an entity he called the Harbinger. One entry, dated weeks before Jeremiah's disappearance, stood out. It described a pact he had made with the Harbinger, a deal that promised him eternal glory in exchange for a single unthinkable act. John's hands shook as he read the words, his mind struggling to process their meaning. Jeremiah had agreed to sacrifice his own family, sealing their souls to the mansion in exchange for unimaginable power. The final entry was written in a frantic, almost illegible hand, its words smeared with what John feared was blood. "It is done," Jeremiah wrote. "The Harbinger is pleased, but now it demands more." John slammed the diary shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt sick, his stomach churning as the weight of Jeremiah's words settled over him. The whispers in the walls seemed to grow louder, their voices mocking and cruel, as if they knew he had uncovered the mansion's terrible secret. He stumbled out of the library, clutching the diary to his chest, and found Sarah in the kitchen. Her face paled as she saw the look in his eyes, and she asked him what was wrong. John hesitated before handing her the diary, his voice trembling as he urged her to read it. Sarah's hands shook as she flipped through the journal's pages, her eyes widening with horror as she absorbed its contents. She looked up at John, her face a mask of disbelief and fear. "This can't be real," she whispered. though the oppressive atmosphere of the house suggested otherwise. The Thompsons knew they were no longer dealing with mere hauntings. They were trapped in a cycle of sacrifice, bound by a pact made decades ago. The diary's revelations only deepened their despair, leaving them feeling more helpless than ever. That evening, the family gathered in the living room, the portrait of Eleanor Blackwood watching them with its eerie, unblinking gaze. John placed the diary on the coffee table, its presence a grim reminder of the horrors they faced. Michael and Emily listened in silence as their parents recounted Jeremiah's story, their young minds struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what they were up against. The house seemed to react to their fear, its walls creaking and its shadows deepening, as if it were alive and feeding on their despair. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, their voices more distinct. They spoke of the harbinger, of the sacrifices it demanded, and of the role the Thompsons were destined to play. Emily began to cry, her small body shaking with fear, as she heard her name among the voices. Sarah held her tightly, her own tears falling silently, while Michael stared at the portrait, his face pale and his fists clenched. John felt a surge of anger, his fear momentarily overshadowed by the need to protect his family, but he knew he was powerless against the forces at work. The next morning, John awoke with a sense of resolve. He couldn't let Jeremiah's story repeat itself. He had to find a way to break the cycle. He returned to the library, the diary in hand, and began researching the symbols and rituals described in its pages. The book Emily had found earlier seemed to hold the key, its cryptic text offering clues to the harbinger's nature and how to defeat it. John spent hours poring over the pages, his eyes burning from the strain, but the answers remained elusive. Sarah, meanwhile, focused on keeping the children safe. She tried to distract them with games and stories, but the house's oppressive atmosphere made it impossible to forget their plight. Emily, still haunted by the woman in the black dress, clung to her mother, her once bright personality dimmed by fear. Michael, though he tried to act strong, began to withdraw, his face pale and his eyes hollow. The family was unraveling, their bonds weakened by the constant terror that surrounded them. That night, the house came alive in ways they had never imagined. The walls bled, dark streaks of red oozing from the cracks, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The Thompsons huddled together in the living room, their flashlights casting flickering beams of light on the chaos around them. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood began to shift, its surface rippling like water, as the woman's eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Her laughter filled the room, soft and menacing, as she stepped out of the painting, her form solid and real. The family screamed, their voices blending into a cacophony of fear as Eleanor approached them. Her face was serene, but her eyes burned with malice, and her voice, when she spoke, was cold and commanding. "The harbinger demands its due," she said, her words sending chills down their spines. John stood in front of his family, his body trembling but his resolve unshaken, as he tried to shield them from the spirit's wrath. But Eleanor was unstoppable, her power overwhelming, and the Thompsons knew they were no match for her. As the night dragged on, the family weakened, their will to fight slipping away. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a deafening roar, and the shadows closed in around them. Emily's eyes began to glaze over, her connection to Eleanor growing stronger with each passing moment, while Michael's nightmares became more vivid, his dreams filled with images of the harbinger. Sarah clung to her children, her tears falling silently, as John prayed for a miracle he knew wouldn't come. By morning, the house was quiet, its oppressive atmosphere momentarily lifted. The Thompsons awoke on the living room floor, their bodies bruised and their minds shattered. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood hung on the wall, its surface smooth and unchanged, but the family knew the respite was temporary. The harbinger's demands were growing louder, its hold on them tightening with each passing day. John, though broken, vowed to find a way to save his family, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. The days that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion. The Thompsons moved through the house like ghosts themselves, their once vibrant personalities dimmed by the relentless terror that surrounded them. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood loomed over them, its gaze unyielding, a constant reminder of the darkness that had claimed the mansion. John spent every waking moment in the library, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking as he pored over the book of rituals and Jeremiah's diary. He was determined to find a way to break the cycle, but the answers remained just out of reach. The whispers returned with a vengeance, their voices louder and more insistent than ever. They spoke of the Harbinger, of its power and its hunger, and of the Thompsons' role in its dark plan. Emily, weakened by her connection to Eleanor, began to hear the whispers even in her sleep, her dreams filled with images of the woman in the black dress and the glowing eyes of the Harbinger. She woke up screaming every night, her voice hoarse and her body drenched in sweat, while Sarah held her tightly, tears streaming down her face. One evening, as the family tried to eat dinner, the house came alive around them. The walls groaned and shuddered, the floorboards creaking as if the mansion itself was in pain. The air grew colder, frost forming on the windows despite the warm summer night outside. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a deafening roar, as shadows moved across the walls like living things. John slammed his fists on the table, his frustration boiling over, and shouted for the voices to stop. But the house only seemed to feed on his anger, its energy growing more malevolent with each passing moment. By nightfall, the Thompsons were too exhausted to fight. They huddled together in the living room, their flashlights casting flickering beams of light on the chaos around them. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood began to shift, its surface rippling like water, as the woman's eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Her laughter filled the room, soft and menacing, as she stepped out of the painting, her form solid and real. The family screamed, their voices blending into a cacophony of fear, as Eleanor approached them with a cruel smile on her lips. "The Harbinger demands its due," she said, her voice cold and commanding. Her words sent chills down their spines, filling them with a sense of dread that was impossible to shake. John stood in front of his family, his body trembling but his resolve unshaken, as he tried to shield them from the spirit's wrath. But Eleanor was unstoppable, her power overwhelming, and the Thompsons knew they were no match for her. Her laughter echoed through the house, her form dissolving into a cloud of smoke that filled the room. When the smoke cleared, the family was alone, their bodies bruised and their minds shattered. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood hung on the wall, its surface smooth and unchanged, but their fear remained. They knew the respite was temporary. The Harbinger's demands were growing louder, its hold on them tightening with each passing day. John, though broken, vowed to find a way to save his family, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. He returned to the library, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages of the book, searching for an answer they all desperately needed. The next morning, Sarah awoke to find Emily missing. Her heart raced as she searched the house, calling her daughter's name, but there was no response. The whispers seemed to grow louder with each passing moment, their voices guiding her to the basement. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, her flashlight trembling in her hand, before forcing herself to descend. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around her. At the bottom, she found Emily standing in front of a large, ornate mirror, her eyes glassy and her face pale. "Emily!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with desperation. But her daughter didn't respond. She just stared at the mirror, her lips moving as if she were speaking to someone only she could see. Sarah grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her away from the mirror, but her daughter's body was stiff, as if she were in a trance. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a chaotic roar, as the glass of the mirror began to ripple. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw a figure emerge from its surface, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. The Harbinger stepped out of the mirror, its presence filling the room with an oppressive energy. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice was gone, swallowed by the entity's power. Emily stumbled backward, her trance broken, and clung to her mother as the Harbinger approached them. Its voice, deep and resonant, filled the room, its words dripping with malice. "You are mine," it said, its glowing eyes fixed on Emily. Sarah held her daughter tightly, her body trembling as she tried to shield her from the entity's wrath. John, drawn to the commotion, burst into the basement, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He grabbed a heavy candlestick and charged at the harbinger, his desperation giving him strength. But the entity was untouchable, its form dissipating into smoke as John's weapon passed through it. The harbinger laughed, its voice echoing through the room, before dissolving into the shadows. The Thompsons were left alone, their bodies bruised and their minds shattered, as the whispers faded into an eerie silence. By evening, the house was quiet, its oppressive atmosphere momentarily lifted. But the family knew it was only a matter of time before the harbinger returned. John, though shaken, refused to give up. He returned to the library, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages of the book, searching for an answer. He knew they were running out of time. The harbinger's demands were growing louder, and its hold on Emily was tightening with each passing day. If they didn't find a way to break the cycle soon, they would lose her forever. The days blurred together, each one marked by the same relentless terror. The Thompsons grew weaker, their bodies and minds pushed to the brink, but they refused to give up. John spent every waking moment in the library, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking as he searched for a solution. Sarah focused on keeping the children safe, her heart breaking as she watched Emily slip further into the harbinger's grasp. Michael, though he tried to act strong, grew more withdrawn, his nightmares becoming more vivid with each passing night. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, the whispers returned with a vengeance. Their voices were louder and more distinct than ever, speaking of the harbinger and its insatiable hunger. Emily began to cry, her small body shaking with fear, as she heard her name among the voices. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood shifted once more, its surface rippling as the woman's face twisted into a cruel smile. Her laughter filled the room, soft and menacing, as she stepped out of the painting, her form solid and real. The family screamed, their voices blending into a cacophony of fear, as Eleanor approached them with glowing eyes. By morning, the house was quiet, its oppressive atmosphere momentarily lifted. But the Thompsons knew the respite was temporary. The harbinger's demands were growing louder, and their time was running out. John, though broken, vowed to find a way to save his family, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. He returned to the library, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages of the book, searching for an answer. He knew they couldn't fight the harbinger, but perhaps they could escape it. The Thompsons' search for answers led them to the abandoned asylum on the edge of Blackwood Manor's property. It was a crumbling structure, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy, but it seemed to hold a dark connection to the mansion. John had found references to the asylum in Jeremiah's diary, suggesting it was a key to understanding the harbinger's origins. Despite their fear, the family knew they had no choice. They had to confront the evil that had haunted them for so long. As they approached the asylum, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, their voices soft but insistent. The building loomed before them, its shadow stretching across the overgrown lawn like a dark hand reaching out to claim them. Sarah hesitated at the entrance, her hand trembling as she reached for the rusted door. Emily clung to her mother's side, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear, while Michael stayed close to John, his fists clenched in a futile attempt to appear brave. Inside, the asylum was a labyrinth of decaying hallways and broken furniture, its walls covered in peeling paint and strange symbols. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and the whispers grew louder, their voices echoing through the empty halls. The Thompsons moved cautiously, their flashlights casting flickering beams of light on the chaos around them. Every creak and groan of the building seemed to be a warning, a reminder that they were trespassing in a place that did not welcome the living. In the asylum's central hallway, they found a large, rusted door marked "Restricted Access." The whispers seemed to emanate from behind it, their voices overlapping into a cacophony of sound. John hesitated before forcing the door open, his heart pounding in his chest. The room beyond was dark and windowless, its walls covered in more of the strange symbols they had seen throughout the house. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and covered in dust. As John stepped closer to the mirror, the whispers grew louder, their voices more distinct. They spoke of the harbinger, of its power and its hunger, and of the role the Thompsons were destined to play. The air grew colder, frost forming on the walls and floor, as the mirror's surface began to ripple. John stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. As a figure emerged from the mirror, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. The harbinger stepped out of the mirror, its presence filling the room with an oppressive energy. The Thompsons screamed, their voices blending into a cacophony of fear as the entity approached them. Its voice, deep and resonant, filled the room, its words dripping with malice. "You cannot escape," it said, its glowing eyes fixed on Emily. Sarah held her daughter tightly, her body trembling as she tried to shield her from the entity's wrath. John, desperate to protect his family, charged at the harbinger with a rusted piece of metal he had found on the floor. But the entity was untouchable, its form dissipating into smoke as John's weapon passed through it. The harbinger laughed, its voice echoing through the room, before dissolving into the shadows. The Thompsons were left alone, their bodies bruised and their minds shattered, as the whispers faded into an eerie silence. By evening, the asylum was quiet, its oppressive atmosphere momentarily lifted. But the family knew it was only a matter of time before the harbinger returned. John, though shaken, refused to give up. He returned to the library, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages of the book, searching for an answer. He knew they were running out of time, the harbinger's demands were growing louder, and its hold on Emily was tightening with each passing day. If they didn't find a way to break the cycle soon, they would lose her forever. The days blurred together, each one marked by the same relentless terror. The Thompsons grew weaker, their bodies and minds pushed to the brink, but they refused to give up. John spent every waking moment in the library, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking as he searched for a solution. Sarah focused on keeping the children safe, her heart breaking as she watched Emily slip further into the harbinger's grasp. Michael, though he tried to act strong, grew more withdrawn, his nightmares becoming more vivid with each passing night. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, the whispers returned with a vengeance. Their voices were louder and more distinct than ever, speaking of the harbinger and its insatiable hunger. Emily began to cry, her small body shaking with fear, as she heard her name among the voices. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood shifted once more, its surface rippling as the woman's face twisted into a cruel smile. Her laughter filled the room, soft and menacing, as she stepped out of the painting, her form solid and real. The family screamed, their voices blending into a cacophony of fear, as Eleanor approached them with glowing eyes. By morning, the house was quiet, its oppressive atmosphere momentarily lifted. But the Thompsons knew the respite was temporary, the harbinger's demands were growing louder, and their time was running out. John, though broken, vowed to find a way to save his family, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. He returned to the library, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages of the book, searching for an answer. He knew they couldn't fight the harbinger, but perhaps they could escape it and the dim light of the library. John's hands trembled as he turned the fragile pages of the ancient book. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, but his focus was razor-sharp. After weeks of searching, he had finally found a passage that spoke of a ritual of binding, a way to trap a malevolent spirit within an object permanently. The text was cryptic, written in a language that seemed to shift and twist the longer he stared at it, but John clung to it like a lifeline. If this ritual worked, it could save his family from the harbinger's relentless grasp. But there was a cost, one he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. Sarah watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the dark circles under his eyes, and the way his hands shook as they traced the words on the page. She stepped into the room, her voice soft but laced with concern. "What is it?" she asked. John looked up, his expression a mix of hope and dread, before explaining the ritual. Sarah's face paled as she listened, her mind reeling at the implications. Is it the only way? She whispered, her voice trembling. John nodded, his jaw clenched. Emily, meanwhile, sat curled in a corner of the living room, her small frame dwarfed by the oppressive presence of the portrait. She could feel Eleanor's eyes on her, even when she turned away, the woman's cold gaze boring into her soul. The whispers had grown louder in her mind, their voices no longer separate but merging into one, a commanding voice that spoke of power and belonging. She clutched her knees to her chest, her tears silent as she tried to block it out, but the voice was relentless. "You are mine," it said, over and over, until the words felt like a part of her. Michael, too, was struggling. The nightmares that had plagued him for weeks had grown more vivid, each one ending with the same horrifying image, the Harbinger, its glowing red eyes locked onto him as it reached out with clawed hands. He had started sleeping with the lights on, but even that offered little comfort. The house itself seemed to be alive, its walls breathing, its shadows moving when no one was looking. He found himself avoiding certain rooms, especially the basement, where he swore he could hear footsteps echoing in the dark. The family gathered in the library that evening, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. John spread the book open on the table, its pages filled with strange symbols and diagrams. He explained the ritual in detail, his voice steady but tight with fear. It required a sacrifice, a piece of themselves, something irreplaceable, and the creation of a vessel to contain the Harbinger. Sarah's hand found his, her grip tight, as she asked the question they were all thinking, "Can we even trust this?" John hesitated before answering. "We don't have a choice." As midnight approached, the family began preparing for the ritual. The air in the house grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting to see if they would succeed. John gathered the materials listed in the book: a silver dagger, candles made of black wax, and a small, ornate box that had belonged to Jeremiah Blackwood. Sarah lit the candles, their flickering light casting long shadows on the walls, while Michael and Emily sat close together, their hands clasped tightly. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood hung nearby, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight, as if she knew what they were attempting. The ritual began with an incantation, its words foreign and guttural, as John traced a circle of salt around the family. The air inside the circle grew colder, their breaths visible in the dim light, as the whispers outside grew louder. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting and twisting, as the Harbinger's presence filled the room. Emily began to sob, her small body shaking, as the voice in her mind screamed louder than ever. Sarah held her tightly, her own tears falling silently, while Michael stood firm, his eyes locked on the circle's edge. The Harbinger appeared slowly, its form materializing from the shadows like smoke coalescing into shape. Its glowing red eyes focused on the family, its lips curling into a cruel smile. "You cannot bind me," it said, its voice deep and resonant, sending chills through their bodies. John ignored it, his voice rising as he continued the incantation, the words growing louder and more urgent. The Harbinger laughed, its form shifting and twisting, as it reached out with clawed hands toward the circle. The air crackled with energy, the candles flickering wildly, as the entity's power clashed with the ritual. John's hand tightened around the dagger, his heart pounding as he prepared for the next step. The ritual required a sacrifice, a piece of his soul, bound to the vessel. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing the blade to his palm, his blood dripping onto the box. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, as the Harbinger's form began to distort, its expression shifting from amusement to rage. "You dare defy me?" it roared, its voice shaking the walls. John's voice rose to match it, his words echoing through the room as the ritual reached its climax. The box began to glow, its surface etched with the same symbols as the book, as the Harbinger's form was drawn toward it. The entity fought against the pull, its claws digging into the floor, but the ritual's power was too strong. The air filled with a deafening roar as the Harbinger was forced into the box, its glowing eyes locked onto John until the very end. The lid snapped shut with a final, echoing click, and the room fell silent. The candles extinguished, plunging the room into darkness as the family sat in stunned silence. For a moment, there was only stillness. Then, the whispers returned, their voices softer but more distinct. "You think this is the end?" they said, their tone mocking. John's heart sank as the box began to shake, the symbols on its surface flickering faintly. The sacrifice had worked for now. But the ritual hadn't destroyed the harbinger, it had only contained it. The family knew they had bought themselves time, but the threat was far from over. The box would need to be guarded, kept safe from anyone who might try to open it. The days that followed were marked by a fragile peace. The house was quieter, the whispers softer, but the family knew the danger wasn't gone. John kept the box in the library, hidden away behind a false panel, while Sarah focused on keeping the children safe. Emily seemed more like herself, the voice in her mind finally silent, but the experience had left her scarred. Michael, too, was quieter, his nightmares less frequent but still haunting. The family knew they couldn't stay in the mansion forever, but leaving meant risking the box falling into the wrong hands. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, the portrait of Eleanor Blackwood caught Sarah's eye. The woman's expression had changed, her serene smile was gone, replaced by a look of pure hatred. Sarah shivered, her heart pounding, as she realized the truth. The harbinger might have been contained, but Eleanor's spirit was still free. The house wasn't done with them, not yet. As the whispers began to grow louder once more, the family knew their fight was far from over. The ritual of binding had bought them time, but the true battle was just beginning. The fragile peace the Thompsons had found after the ritual of binding lasted only a week. The house, though quieter, still thrummed with an uneasy energy, as if it were holding its breath. The box containing the harbinger remained locked in the library, its presence a constant reminder of the danger they had managed to contain for now. But the whispers, though softer, never truly ceased. They lingered at the edges of their minds, insidious and unrelenting, a reminder that their battle was far from over. John kept a vigilant watch over the box, his paranoia growing with each passing day. One night, Emily awoke to the sound of footsteps outside her door. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, her small hands clutching the blanket tightly around her. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, accompanied by the faint sound of someone humming a tune she didn't recognize. The doorknob rattled, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She called out softly for her mother, but no one answered. The footsteps paused outside her door, and the humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, Emily told her parents what she had heard, her voice trembling as she recounted the experience. Sarah held her tightly, her face pale with fear, while John's expression darkened. He knew the house wasn't safe, not even with the harbinger contained. The ritual of binding had weakened the entity, but it hadn't destroyed it entirely. The whispers and strange occurrences were proof that the harbinger's influence still lingered, seeping through the cracks like a poison. The family couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a moment. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, the portrait of Eleanor Blackwood caught their attention. Her expression had shifted once again, her serene smile replaced by a look of pure malice. Her eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, the painting's presence growing more oppressive with each passing day. John tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the books and notes spread out on the table, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that they were being watched. The house itself seemed to sense their unease, its walls creaking and groaning as if in response. As the sun set, the whispers grew louder, their voices more distinct. They spoke of the box, of the harbinger's confinement, and of the family's inevitable failure. John clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over as he shouted for the voices to stop. But the house only seemed to feed on his anger, its energy growing more malevolent with each passing moment. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. They were running out of time. The harbinger's return was only a matter of when, not if. That night, the shadows in the house began to shift, their movements slow and deliberate. Sarah watched from the corner of her eye as a shadow detached from the wall, its form solidifying into a humanoid shape. She froze, her breath caught in her throat as the shadow approached her. Its face was featureless, but she could feel its gaze on her, cold and unrelenting. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice was gone, swallowed by the entity's power. The shadow reached out with a clawed hand, its touch like ice against her skin, before dissolving into smoke. The family awoke the next morning to a house that felt colder, its walls damp and its air heavy with the scent of decay. The whispers were louder than ever, their voices overlapping into a chaotic roar, as the shadows continued to shift and move. John knew they couldn't stay in the mansion much longer. The Harbinger's influence was growing stronger, and the ritual of binding was beginning to weaken. But leaving meant abandoning the box, risking the Harbinger's release. The family was trapped, their choices dwindling with each passing day. By evening, the house was alive with activity, its walls bleeding and its shadows moving like living things. The whispers were deafening, their voices merging into a single, commanding tone, the Harbinger's voice. The family huddled together in the living room, their flashlights casting flickering beams of light on the chaos around them. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood began to shift, its surface rippling like water, as the woman's eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Her laughter filled the room, soft and menacing, as she stepped out of the painting, her form solid and real. "The Harbinger demands its due," Eleanor said, her voice cold and commanding. Her words sent chills down their spines, filling them with a sense of dread that was impossible to shake. John stood in front of his family, his body trembling but his resolve unshaken, as he tried to shield them from the spirit's wrath. But Eleanor was unstoppable, her power overwhelming, and the Thompsons knew they were no match for her. Her laughter echoed through the house, her form dissolving into a cloud of smoke that filled the room. When the smoke cleared, the family was alone, their bodies bruised and their minds shattered. The portrait of Eleanor Blackwood hung on the wall, its surface smooth and unchanged, but their fear remained. They knew the respite was temporary. The Harbinger's demands were growing louder, and their time was running out. John, though broken, vowed to find a way to save his family, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. He returned to the library, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages of the book, searching for an answer. The next morning, John found Sarah in the kitchen, her face pale and her eyes hollowed. She had spent the night awake, listening to the whispers and watching the shadows move. The toll of the house's influence was evident in her slumped posture and trembling hands. John placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. They both knew the truth. They couldn't stay in the mansion much longer. The Harbinger's return was inevitable, and their only chance at survival was to find a way to destroy it once and for all. As the day wore on, the family prepared for what they hoped would be their final confrontation with the Harbinger. John gathered the necessary materials for another ritual, this one more dangerous than the last, while Sarah focused on keeping the children safe. Michael and Emily sat close together, their hands clasped tightly, as the whispers grew louder and the shadows closer. The house seemed to sense their determination, its walls creaking and groaning in protest, but the family refused to back down. That evening, as the sun set, the Thompsons gathered in the library. The box containing the Harbinger sat on the table, its surface etched with the same symbols as the book. John began the ritual, his voice steady but laced with fear, as the air grew colder and the shadows closed in. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a deafening roar, as the Harbinger's presence filled the room. The family huddled together, their resolve unshaken, as they prepared to face the entity one last time. The library was a cacophony of chaos as the ritual began. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing in a frenzied rhythm, while the air grew colder with each passing second. John stood at the center of it all, his hands trembling as he held the ancient book open. The incantation spilled from his lips, the words foreign and guttural, each syllable heavy with the weight of desperation. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a deafening roar, as the shadows in the room began to shift and twist. The family huddled together, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear, as the Harbinger's presence filled the room. The box containing the Harbinger sat on the table, its surface etched with glowing symbols that pulsed with an ominous light. The lid rattled, the wood splintering as the entity fought against its confinement. Sarah clutched Emily and Michael tightly, her heart pounding in her chest, as John's voice rose to match the growing chaos. The air crackled with energy, the walls of the library groaning as if the house itself were alive and resisting the ritual. The family knew this was their last chance. If the Harbinger broke free, they would all be lost. As John reached the final lines of the incantation, the box exploded in a burst of dark energy, the force of it throwing the family to the ground. The Harbinger emerged from the wreckage, its form towering and monstrous, its glowing red eyes fixed on the Thompsons. Its voice was deep and resonant, its words dripping with malice as it spoke. "You cannot destroy me," it said, its claws flexing as it stepped closer. John scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking as he held the book and dagger, his resolve unshaken. He knew this was their only hope. The ritual required a sacrifice, a life given willingly to sever the Harbinger's connection to the mortal plane. John had known from the moment he found the passage what it would mean. He looked at his family, his heart breaking as he met Sarah's tear-filled eyes. "I love you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. Sarah screamed, her voice raw with desperation, as John plunged the dagger into his chest. The room fell silent, the Harbinger's laughter replaced by a low, guttural growl as the light in John's eyes dimmed. The blood from John's sacrifice pooled on the floor, the symbols etched into the wood glowing brighter as the ritual reached its climax. The Harbinger roared, its form distorting as it was pulled toward the center of the circle. The air filled with a deafening cacophony of screams and whispers, the walls of the library shaking as the entity fought against the ritual's power. Sarah held her children tightly, her body trembling as she watched the final moments of the confrontation unfold. The symbols flared with a blinding light, and the Harbinger let out one final, earth-shattering roar before it was consumed by the light. When the light faded, the library was silent. The Harbinger was gone, its presence erased from the house, but the cost had been devastating. John's body lay at the center of the circle, his face calm and serene in death. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she brushed the hair from his forehead. Emily and Michael stood close, their small faces streaked with tears, their minds struggling to process what had happened. The house, though silent, no longer felt oppressive. The darkness that had haunted them for so long was finally gone. The days that followed were a blur of grief and exhaustion. The family buried John in the garden, his final resting place a quiet corner near the old oak tree. Sarah tried to hold herself together for the children, but the weight of her loss was crushing. The house, though free of the Harbinger's influence, still held memories of the horrors they had endured. Every creak and groan of the walls sent a shiver down her spine, and the portrait of Eleanor Blackwood remained a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced. Emily, though relieved to be free of the whispers, struggled to sleep at night. She would wake up screaming, her dreams filled with images of the Harbinger and her father's sacrifice. Sarah held her tightly, her own heart breaking as she tried to comfort her daughter. Michael, too, was quiet, his once vibrant personality dulled by the trauma of what he had witnessed. The family knew they couldn't stay in the mansion much longer. It held too many painful memories, and the scars of their ordeal would never fully heal. One morning, as Sarah packed their belongings, she found herself drawn to the library. The room was still in disarray, the remnants of the ritual scattered across the floor. She knelt beside the circle of salt, her fingers tracing the symbols etched into the wood. The pain of losing John was still fresh, but she couldn't help feeling a sense of gratitude for what he had done. His sacrifice had saved them, even if it had cost him everything. The family would carry his memory with them, a reminder of the strength and love that had seen them through the darkness. By evening, the family was ready to leave. The mansion stood silent, its walls no longer breathing with malevolent energy, but the weight of its history was still felt. Sarah took one last look at the house, her heart heavy with grief and relief, before leading the children to the car. As they drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, its dark windows like hollow eyes. But she knew the truth: the harbinger was gone, and their family could finally begin to heal. The road ahead was uncertain, but the family was determined to move forward. Sarah found a small apartment in the nearby town, a place where they could start anew. The children slowly began to open up, their laughter returning as the weight of the mansion's horrors faded. Sarah found comfort in the routines of their new life, though the pain of losing John remained a constant presence. But she knew they had survived the worst, and that gave her the strength to keep going. One evening, as the family sat together in the apartment, Emily brought out a small box she had found in her room. Inside was a photograph of John, his smile warm and familiar. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she held the photo, her heart aching with the loss of her husband. But she also felt a sense of peace. They had survived, and John's sacrifice had not been in vain. The family knew they would carry his memory with them, a reminder of the love that had saved them from the darkness. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the small apartment, casting a warm golden light across the modest living room. Sarah sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, her gaze distant. The silence was unfamiliar, almost unnerving, after the constant whispers and creaks of the mansion. But it was a silence she welcomed, a reminder that they were finally free. The scars of their ordeal were still raw, but the darkness that had haunted them for so long was gone. She took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the tea soothe her nerves. Emily and Michael sat at the small kitchen table, their plates of breakfast untouched. The children were quiet, their minds still processing everything that had happened. Emily traced a finger along the edge of her plate, her thoughts lingering on her father. She missed him terribly, his absence a constant ache in her chest, but she also felt a strange sense of pride. Her father had been a hero, and she was determined to honor his memory. Michael, on the other hand, stared out the window, his eyes distant. The trauma of the mansion still lingered, but he was slowly beginning to find moments of peace. Sarah joined them at the table, her presence grounding as always. She reached out, placing a hand on each of their shoulders, her touch a silent reassurance. "We'll be okay," she said softly, her voice steady despite the pain in her heart. The children nodded, their faces solemn but hopeful. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were determined to move forward together. They owed it to John to rebuild their lives, to find happiness again after everything they had endured. The thought of him gave them strength, his love a guiding light in their darkest moments. As the days turned into weeks, the family slowly settled into their new routine. Sarah found a part-time job at a local bookstore, the quiet atmosphere a welcome change from the chaos of the mansion. The children returned to school, their days filled with the simple joys of childhood friendships, laughter, and the occasional homework assignment. The horrors of Blackwood Manor began to fade, replaced by the mundane yet comforting rhythms of their new life. The scars remained, but they were healing, slowly but surely. One evening, as Sarah tucked Emily into bed, the girl reached out and took her mother's hand. "Do you think Dad can see us?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. Sarah's heart ached at the question, but she smiled softly as she brushed a strand of hair from Emily's face. "I think he's always with us," she replied, her voice filled with warmth. "In everything we do, in every moment we share, he's here." Emily nodded, her eyes closing as she clung to her mother's words. Sarah stayed with her until she fell asleep, her own heart heavy but filled with love. Michael, too, began to open up more, his once withdrawn demeanor softening with time. He joined a soccer team at school, the physical activity helping to channel his emotions in a healthy way. Sarah watched him practice one afternoon, her heart swelling with pride as she saw him smile and laugh with his teammates. It was a small victory, but it meant the world to her. The scars of the mansion would always be a part of him, but he was learning to live with them, to find joy despite the pain. The family began to establish new traditions, small rituals that helped them stay connected. They started a weekly movie night, complete with popcorn and blankets, the laughter and warmth a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the mansion. They also began visiting John's grave every Sunday, the quiet moments of reflection, a way to honor his memory. Emily would leave small drawings she had made, while Michael would share stories about his week. Sarah would simply stand there, her hand resting on the headstone, her heart filled with love and gratitude. One Sunday, as they walked home from the cemetery, Emily looked up at her mother. "Do you think we'll ever go back to the mansion?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Sarah paused, her heart tightening at the thought. "No," she said after a moment, her voice firm but gentle. "That place belongs to the past. Our future is here, together." Emily nodded, her small hand slipping into her mother's. The mansion had taken so much from them, but it had also shown them the strength of their love. They had faced the darkness and come out stronger on the other side. As the months passed, the family began to find a sense of normalcy again. The pain of losing John never fully disappeared, but it became a part of who they were, a reminder of the love they had shared. Sarah found herself laughing more, the joy returning to her life in small but significant ways. The children, too, began to thrive, their resilience a testament to the strength they had inherited from their father. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were a reminder of what they had survived. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Sarah brought out an old photo album she had found in a box. The pages were filled with pictures of John, his smile warm and familiar, his eyes filled with love. The children pored over the photos, their laughter and tears mingling as they shared stories of their father. Sarah watched them, her heart filled with a bittersweet mix of joy and sorrow. John's presence was still felt in every moment, his love a guiding force in their lives. The family knew they would carry him with them always. By the end of the year, the family had fully settled into their new life. The apartment felt like home, filled with laughter and warmth, the shadows of the mansion a distant memory. Sarah had returned to her love of painting, the creative outlet helping her process her emotions in a healthy way. The children, too, had found their own passions, Emily's love of drawing and Michael's newfound interest in soccer. The family was rebuilding, their bond stronger than ever, the love that had saved them from the darkness now guiding them toward a brighter future. One morning, Sarah woke up early, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the window. She sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts drifting to John. She missed him deeply, but she also felt a sense of peace. Their time together had been cut short, but the love they had shared would always be a part of her. She smiled softly as she thought of their life together, the laughter, the warmth, the moments of joy. John's sacrifice had given them a second chance, and she was determined to make the most of it. Later that day, as the family sat together in the living room, Sarah looked at her children. "I'm proud of us," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We've been through so much, but we're still here together." Emily and Michael smiled, their faces filled with love and determination. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but they were ready to face it as a family. The darkness of the mansion was behind them, and a new dawn was beginning. They had survived the worst, and they were stronger for it. As the days turned into months and the months into years, the family continued to heal. The pain of the past never fully disappeared, but it became a part of their story, a reminder of the strength and love that had carried them through. The mansion became a distant memory, its horrors fading as they built a new life filled with joy and hope. John's legacy lived on in the hearts of his family, his love a guiding light in their darkest moments. The Thompsons had faced the ultimate evil and emerged victorious, their bond unshakable, their future bright. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the cracked asphalt of Black Hollow, a small, forgotten town nestled deep in the Ohio countryside. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light swaying in the wind. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were buried but never forgotten. Yet, that night, Something sinister stirred in the shadows, something that would shake the town to its core. The first victim was found just before dawn, her lifeless body discovered in her quaint, white picket-fenced home. Sarah Mitchell was a schoolteacher, beloved by her students and respected by the community. She was the kind of person who always had a warm smile and a kind word, the type who seemed untouched by the darkness of the world. Her house, a modest two-story with ivy climbing the walls, stood at the edge of town, where the woods began to creep in like a silent predator. When the sheriff arrived, he hesitated at the door, sensing that what awaited him inside would change everything. The air smelled faintly of copper and something else, something he couldn't quite place but left him nauseous. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. The furniture was neat, the dishes washed and put away, as if Sarah had been expecting company. But as the sheriff stepped further into the living room, he froze. Sarah's body lay on the sofa, her hands folded neatly across her chest, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, but it was the expression etched into her features that made his blood run cold. It was pure, unbridled terror, as if she had seen something beyond comprehension in her final moments. The sheriff called for backup, his voice trembling as he radioed the station. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone in the house, that something was watching him from the shadows. The other officers arrived quickly, their faces pale as they took in the scene. No one spoke. The weight of what they were seeing was too heavy for words. Sarah's home, once warm and inviting, now felt like a tomb, the walls closing in with every passing second. The forensic team took photos and dusted for prints, but there was no sign of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. It wasn't until they moved her body that they noticed the symbol. It was carved into her left forearm, just above the wrist, the lines precise and deliberate. The mark was strange, almost ritualistic, a series of interlocking circles and jagged lines that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. No one recognized it, though a few of the older officers exchanged uneasy glances. The sheriff ordered them to keep the details to themselves, but in a town like Black Hollow, rumors spread faster than wildfire. By midday, the entire town knew about the murder, and fear began to seep into every corner. The news of Sarah's death spread like a plague, turning the once vibrant community into a ghost town. Parents kept their children indoors, curtains were drawn, and the streets emptied before sunset. The sheriff held a press conference, assuring the townsfolk that they were doing everything in their power to catch the killer, but his words rang hollow. He had seen the symbol, felt its malevolence, and he knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The killer wasn't finished. Sarah was just the first. As the days passed, the investigation stalled. The forensic evidence yielded nothing. The symbol remained a mystery, and witnesses were scarce. The sheriff spent his nights poring over the case files, the image of Sarah's terrified face haunting his dreams. He would wake in a cold sweat, the feeling of being watched lingering long after the sun rose. He began to question every detail, every motive, but the answers eluded him. The killer was a ghost, moving through the town unseen and unheard. Then, one night, as he was working late, the sheriff received a call from the coroner. The autopsy had revealed something unexpected, something that made his stomach churn. In Sarah's blood, they found traces of a rare toxin, one that induced paralysis but left the victim fully conscious. She had been unable to move, unable to scream, as the killer carved the symbol into her flesh. The thought made him sick, the idea that Sarah had been awake, aware, and utterly helpless as her life was stolen from her. The sheriff knew he was out of his depth. He called the FBI, requesting assistance from any available agent. When they arrived, he felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished. The agents were professional, efficient, but they too were unnerved by the symbol. One of them, a seasoned investigator named James Donovan, took charge of the case. He was a man with a reputation for solving the unsolvable, but even he seemed shaken by what he saw. As he stood in Sarah's living room, staring at the sofa where her body had lain, He felt the weight of the case settle on his shoulders. Donovan began his investigation methodically, interviewing every resident, retracing Sarah's last steps, and examining the symbol with the help of a cryptographer. But the more he dug, the more questions arose. Sarah had no enemies, no secrets, no reason to be targeted. The symbol was ancient, its origins lost to time, but it was clear that the killer had chosen it for a reason. Donovan felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the symbol wasn't just a signature. It was a message, a warning. The killer was taunting them, daring them to stop him. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in Black Hollow grew unbearable. The townsfolk whispered of curses and dark rituals, of evil spirits roaming the woods. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving in the night, heard whispers on the wind, but there was no proof, only fear. Donovan worked tirelessly, driven by a determination to catch the killer before he struck again. But deep down, he knew the killer was always one step ahead, watching, waiting, biding his time. The second victim was found a week after Sarah Mitchell's murder, and the town of Black Hollow plunged deeper into chaos. His name was Eli Thompson, a reclusive farmer who lived on the outskirts of town, where the fields gave way to dense woods. Eli was a man of few words, known for his solitary habits and his distrust of strangers. When he hadn't been seen for a few days, his neighbor, an elderly woman named Mabel, decided to check on him. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. Eli's farmhouse was quiet, the windows dark, the barn doors hanging open. Mabel approached cautiously, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. She called out his name, but there was no answer, only the sound of the wind rustling through the cornfields. The front door was unlocked, and as she stepped inside, the smell hit her first, a mix of decay and something metallic that made her gag. She found Eli in the living room, his body slumped in a chair, his face frozen in the same expression of terror as Sarah's. His chest was bare, and the symbol was there, carved deep into his skin. The lines were precise, almost surgical, but the edges were jagged, as if the killer had taken his time. Mabel stumbled back, her hand over her mouth, and ran to call the sheriff. By the time the authorities arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside Eli's house, their faces pale with fear. The sheriff tried to keep them at bay, but word spread quickly. The killer had struck again, and no one was safe. James Donovan arrived within hours, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of curiosity and dread. He examined the symbol closely, noting its similarities to the one found on Sarah Mitchell. It was larger this time, more prominent, as if the killer were growing bolder. Donovan interviewed Mabel, but she was too shaken to provide much information. She kept repeating the same phrase. He was a good man, a quiet man. He didn't deserve this. Donovan couldn't help but agree, but he knew that the killer wasn't targeting people based on their character. There was a pattern here, and he needed to find it. The forensic team worked through the night, but like before, there was little evidence to go on. Eli's house was clean, almost unnaturally so, as if the killer had meticulously erased his presence. The only clue was the symbol, which seemed to mock them with its mystery. Donovan spent hours studying it, comparing it to the one from Sarah's case, searching for any detail that might unlock its meaning. But the more he stared at it, the more it seemed to shift and twist, like something alive. As dawn broke, Donovan received a call from the FBI's cryptographer, Dr. Evelyn Carter. She had been analyzing the symbol since the first case, and while she couldn't decipher its exact meaning, she had found something unsettling. The design was ancient, rooted in folklore and occult practices, but it had been modified, adapted for a specific purpose. "It's a marker," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "A way of labeling the victims. But for what reason, I can't say." Donovan thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. If the symbol was a marker, then the killer was choosing his victims for a reason. But what linked Sarah Mitchell, a schoolteacher, and Eli Thompson, a farmer? Donovan decided to dig deeper into their lives, searching for any connection, no matter how small. He started with Sarah, interviewing her colleagues, friends, and students. Everyone described her as kind, dedicated, and compassionate, a pillar of the community. There was no evidence of conflict, no grudges or secrets, nothing that would make her a target. Frustrated, Donovan turned his attention to Eli. The farmer kept to himself, rarely interacting with others, but he had no known enemies. The only thing the two victims seemed to share was their goodness, their decency, which made the killings even more senseless. Then, as Donovan was reviewing the case files, something caught his eye. Both Sarah and Eli had been involved in a local trial 5 years earlier, a controversial case that had divided the town. A young man named Daniel Harper had been accused of arson after a barn fire destroyed a family's livelihood. The evidence against him had been circumstantial, but the town had been quick to judge. Sarah had testified against him, describing his erratic behavior, while Eli had been part of the jury that convicted him. Harper had maintained his innocence, but the verdict was unanimous. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison but was released early for good behavior. Donovan's pulse quickened as he realized the significance. Could Daniel Harper be the killer? It was a possibility, but something didn't add up. The murders were too calculated, too precise, to be the work of a man seeking simple revenge. And then there was the symbol, which suggested a deeper, more sinister motive. Donovan decided to visit Harper's last known address, a dilapidated house on the edge of town. When he arrived, the property was abandoned, the windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. Harper was gone, but Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. The next day, Donovan held a press conference, urging the townsfolk to remain calm and vigilant. He didn't mention Harper by name, but he hinted that they were pursuing a lead. The crowd was restless, their fear palpable, and Donovan knew that time was running out. The killer wasn't finished, and the pattern was becoming clear. Each victim had played a role in Daniel Harper's conviction, and the symbol was a way of marking them for punishment. But why now? What had triggered the killer's wrath after all these years? As the investigation continued, Donovan found himself haunted by the case. He would wake in the middle of the night, the image of the symbol burning in his mind, its lines twisting and shifting like a living thing. He began to notice it everywhere, in the cracks of the pavement, the patterns of tree branches, the way the shadows fell across his desk. It was as if the symbol had taken on a life of its own, a presence that refused to be ignored. Donovan knew he was losing his grip, but he couldn't stop. The killer was out there, and he would do whatever it took to stop him. The rain returned to Black Hollow, a steady downpour that turned the streets into rivers of mud and fog. Detective James Donovan sat in his car outside the abandoned house that had once belonged to Daniel Harper, staring at the boarded-up windows and the overgrown yard. The place was a relic of the past, a crumbling shell that seemed to hold secrets in its walls. Donovan had spent the last few days piecing together Harper's life, tracing his movements after his release from prison, but the man had vanished without a trace. The townsfolk claimed they hadn't seen him in years, but Donovan wasn't convinced. Harper was here, somewhere, and he was closing in. The investigation had consumed him, his days and nights blending into a blur of case files, interviews, and dead ends. He hardly slept anymore, his dreams haunted by the symbol and the faces of the victims. Sarah Mitchell, Eli Thompson, their lives had been cut short, their deaths marked by something ancient and evil. Donovan had spent hours researching the symbol, consulting experts in folklore and the occult, but its meaning remained elusive. It was a puzzle, a key to understanding the killer's motives, but it was also a taunt, a way of mocking those who sought to stop him. Donovan stepped out of the car, pulling his coat tighter against the rain, and approached the house. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, the wood splintered and weathered. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The rooms were empty, stripped of furniture and life, but Donovan searched every corner, looking for anything that might lead him to Harper. In the attic, he found a single box filled with old photographs and documents. The pictures were faded, But one stood out, a group of people standing outside a courthouse, their faces grim. Among them were Sarah and Eli. The photograph sent a chill through Donovan. It was evidence, a tangible link between the victims and Daniel Harper, but it also raised more questions. Why had they been in that photo? What role had they played in Harper's trial? Donovan took the picture and left the house, his mind racing. He needed to know more about the trial, about the people who had condemned Harper. He began with Sarah's family, visiting her parents at their home on the edge of town. They were reluctant to talk, their grief still raw, but they confirmed that Sarah had testified against Harper. She thought she was doing the right thing, her father said, his voice trembling. She just wanted justice. Justice. The word echoed in Donovan's mind as he drove to Eli Thompson's farm. The place was still cordoned off, the yellow police tape flapping in the wind. Donovan walked the property, retracing Eli's last steps, searching for clues. In the barn, he found a stack of old newspapers, their headlines screaming about the Harper trial. One article caught his eye, an interview with a juror who claimed the verdict had been unanimous but rushed. Eli's name was mentioned, and Donovan felt a pang of unease. The trial had been flawed, the evidence shaky, but the town had been eager to convict. Harper had been a scapegoat, a target for their collective anger. Donovan's next stop was the courthouse, where he pored over the trial records. The more he read, the more he realized how deeply flawed the case had been. The evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, but the jury had been swayed by fear and prejudice. Harper had been convicted not because he was guilty, but because the town needed someone to blame. Donovan felt a surge of frustration, but also a grim determination. The past was coming back to haunt Black Hollow, and he needed to confront it. He began tracking down the other people in the photograph, the ones who had played a role in Harper's conviction. One by one, he found them: a former prosecutor, now retired and living in Florida, a witness who had since moved out of state, a juror who claimed to regret her decision. Each interview brought him closer to the truth, but also closer to the killer. Harper was targeting those who had wronged him, marking them with a symbol as a way of reclaiming his lost justice. It was a twisted form of retribution, but Donovan couldn't deny the logic behind it. The real question was, who would be next? The list of potential victims was growing, and Donovan knew he had to act fast. The FBI brought in additional resources, but Donovan insisted on leading the investigation. He had become obsessed with the case, his every thought consumed by the killer and his motives. He began to see the symbol everywhere, in the patterns of rain on his windshield, the cracks in the pavement, the shadows that danced in the corners of his office. It was as if the case had taken on a life of its own, a malevolent force that refused to let him go. He worked late into the night, piecing together the puzzle, but the killer always seemed one step ahead. Then, one evening, Donovan received a message on his phone, a photograph of the symbol, drawn in blood on a piece of paper. Beneath it was a single word: closer. The message was anonymous, but Donovan knew it was from the killer. It was a taunt, a challenge, a way of reminding him that he was being watched. Donovan's hands shook as he examined the photo, his mind racing with possibilities. Was the killer reaching out to him? Or was this a warning? He didn't know, but he couldn't ignore it. The hunt was on, and the stakes were higher than ever. Donovan began to isolate himself, pushing away his colleagues and friends, his focus narrowing to the case. He stopped sleeping altogether, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, his body on the brink of collapse. His superiors warned him to take a break, but he refused. The killer was out there, and he wasn't going to rest until he was caught. He began to see patterns in everything, connections that might not have existed, but he couldn't stop. The line between reality and obsession blurred, and Donovan felt himself slipping. One night, as he was working in his office, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and Donovan fumbled for his flashlight. The beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing the symbol on his desk, not drawn in blood, but etched into the wood. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, and heard a whisper in the darkness, "You're next." The words sent a shiver down his spine, and he knew the killer was closer than ever. The hunt had turned into a game, and Donovan was losing. The storm raged outside, lightning splitting the sky as thunder shook the walls of Donovan's office. He sat at his desk, the symbol glaring at him from a photograph pinned to the bulletin board. The image was sharp, the lines precise, but it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were watching him. Donovan couldn't look away, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Why had the killer chosen this symbol? What did it mean? And why was he targeting people who had been involved in Daniel Harper's trial? The answers felt just out of reach, taunting him like a cruel joke. The phone on his desk rang, shattering the silence. Donovan hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. It was late, too late for a normal call, and something primal told him not to answer. But he had no choice. It could be a lead, a witness, someone who knew something. He picked up the phone, his voice steady but wary. "Donovan," he said. There was a pause, a crackle of static, and then a voice deep, distorted, and unmistakably menacing. "You're getting closer, detective," the voice said. Donovan froze, his grip tightening on the phone. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the voice ignored him. "The symbol is a key," the caller continued, the words slow and deliberate, as if savoring each one. "But you're too blind to see it. You're looking for patterns, but you're missing the bigger picture." Donovan's mind raced, trying to place the voice, to decipher the words, but it was impossible. The distortion was too heavy, the tone too calculated. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. There was a laugh, low and guttural, like the rumble of thunder. "I want you to understand," the caller said, "to see what I see. But you're not ready, not yet. You'll need to prove yourself first." The line went dead, leaving Donovan in silence. He stared at the phone, his heart pounding, the echo of the caller's words ringing in his ears. It was him. He knew it was the killer, reaching out to him, taunting him. But why? Was it a game? A test? Or something else entirely? Donovan felt a mixture of fear and anger, a fire burning in his chest. He had to act, to do something, but he didn't know where to start. The call had been brief, but it had shaken him to his core. He needed to trace it, to find out where it came from, but he knew it wouldn't be that easy. Donovan called the tech team immediately, demanding they trace the call, but he already suspected it would lead nowhere. The killer was too smart, too meticulous, to leave a trail. While he waited for the results, he replayed the conversation in his mind, analyzing every word. "The symbol is a key," the caller had said. What did that mean? Was it a clue, a way to understand the killer's motives? Or was it just another taunt, designed to confuse him? Donovan didn't know, but he couldn't ignore it. He pulled out his notes, spreading them across his desk, searching for any connection he might have missed. Hours passed, and the storm outside intensified, the rain pounding against the windows like a relentless drumbeat. The tech team called back, their tone apologetic. The call had been untraceable, routed through multiple servers across the globe. It was a dead end, just as Donovan had expected. He hung up, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The killer was playing with him, keeping him in the dark, but Donovan wasn't going to give up. He had faced challenges before, but nothing like this. This was personal, a battle of wills, and he wasn't going to lose. The next morning, he woke to a package on his desk. It hadn't been there when he left the night before, and no one in the office admitted to delivering it. Donovan's stomach churned as he opened it, half expecting something gruesome inside. Instead, he found a cassette tape, the kind that hadn't been used in decades. His hands trembled as he inserted it into an old player he found in the evidence room. The sound that emerged was faint at first, a low hum, but it soon gave way to a chilling voice, the same distorted voice from the phone call. "You're closer than you think," the voice said. "But you're still blind. Open your eyes, detective." The recording ended with a burst of static, leaving Donovan in silence once again. He stared at the tape player, his mind reeling. The killer was communicating with him, sending him messages, and each one was more cryptic than the last. He needed to figure out what they meant, to piece together the puzzle, but he was running out of time. The other people from Harper's trial were still out there, and Donovan knew they were targets. He had to protect them, to stop the killer before he struck again, but he couldn't do it alone. He called his team, briefing them on the new developments, and they sprang into action. They began interviewing the remaining individuals involved in the trial, warning them of the danger, but not everyone was willing to cooperate. Some were in denial, others too afraid to speak, and a few even accused Donovan of stirring up trouble. He understood their fear, but he couldn't let it stop him. The killer was out there, and he was closing in. One by one, they placed the potential targets under surveillance, but it was a daunting task. The town was spread out, the resources limited, and Donovan knew they couldn't watch everyone at once. That night, Donovan received another call. This time, the voice was different, soft, almost hypnotic, but no less menacing. "You're trying to protect them," the caller said. "But you can't save everyone, detective. Some of them deserve what's coming." Donovan clenched his fists, his voice sharp. "Who are you?" he demanded. There was a pause, and then the caller said, "You already know. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet." The line went dead, and Donovan slammed the phone down, his frustration boiling over. The killer was toying with him, twisting his mind, and he hated how powerless he felt. The next day, another victim was found. It was Marcus Reed, a former police officer who had testified at Harper's trial. His body was discovered in the woods, the symbol carved into his chest, his expression frozen in terror. Donovan arrived at the scene, his heart heavy with guilt. He had failed to protect Marcus, and now another life had been taken. The killer was escalating, growing bolder with every move, and Donovan knew he had to act fast. He examined the body, searching for any clues, but there was nothing, no fingerprints, no footprints, no trace of the killer's presence. As the forensic team worked, Donovan stepped away, his mind racing. He needed to think, to clear his head, but the weight of the case was crushing him. He felt like he was on the edge of a precipice, one wrong step away from falling. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and focused on the killer's messages. "The symbol is a key," the caller had said. What did it unlock? The past? The killer's mind? Or something else entirely? Donovan didn't know, but he was determined to find out. He had to understand the killer's motives, to get inside his head, or more lives would be lost. That night, he returned to his office, the storm still raging outside. He sat at his desk, surrounded by case files, his mind sharp with focus. The killer's messages were a challenge, a way of testing him, and Donovan wasn't going to fail. He began to piece together the clues, the patterns, the connections, searching for the truth. The symbol was the key, and he was going to unlock its secrets, no matter the cost. The hunt was far from over, and Donovan wasn't going to stop until the killer was brought to justice. But deep down, he knew the killer was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The storm finally passed, leaving Black Hollow shrouded in a heavy, oppressive fog. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of dripping water. Detective James Donovan stood on the edge of the woods, staring into the mist. It was here, in this very spot, that Marcus Reed's body had been found. The crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, a grim reminder of the killer's handiwork. Donovan's face was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but his mind was sharp, focused. He was close, he could feel it. The symbol had become an obsession, its twisted lines etched into his mind, a constant presence that refused to let him rest. He had spent hours researching it, consulting every expert he could find, but its meaning remained frustratingly elusive. It was ancient, yes, but its purpose was unclear. Was it a mark of vengeance, a ritual, or something else entirely? Donovan didn't know, but he was determined to find out. He had taken to carrying a copy of it in his pocket, unfolding it every now and then to study it, as if staring at it long enough would unlock its secrets. The fog grew thicker as Donovan ventured deeper into the woods, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The ground was soft beneath his feet, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he felt compelled to search. The killer had left a trail, or at least that's what Donovan believed. It was a game, a test, and he was determined to pass. His footsteps were careful, deliberate, each one bringing him further into the heart of the forest. The sound of his breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, the fog swallowing every other noise. As he walked, Donovan thought about the victims Sarah, Eli, Marcus. Their faces flickered in his mind, their expressions frozen in terror. They had been good people, or so it seemed, but the killer had seen something in them, something worth punishing. Donovan had interviewed their families, their friends, their colleagues, but no one had been able to explain why they had been targeted. The only common thread was their involvement in Daniel Harper's trial, but even that didn't make sense. Harper had been released from prison years ago. Why had the killer waited so long to strike? The woods seemed endless, the trees closing in around him, their branches twisted and gnarled like the limbs of some great ancient beast. Donovan's flashlight flickered, the battery dying, and he cursed under his breath. He wasn't sure how far he had come, or how to get back, but he couldn't stop now. The symbol had drawn him here, to this place, and he had to see it through. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and pressed on. The fog swirled around him, cold and wet, clinging to his skin like a second layer of clothing. Then, through the mist, he saw it a clearing, its edges defined by the thick trunks of the surrounding trees. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface blackened as if by fire. Donovan approached cautiously, his heart pounding, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The altar was old, its edges worn smooth by time, but the symbol was there, carved deep into the stone. The lines were precise, deliberate, exactly like the ones found on the victims. Donovan ran his fingers over the carvings, feeling the cold, rough texture of the stone. This was a place of power, of ritual, and the killer had been here. As he stepped back, his foot caught on something, and he stumbled, nearly falling. He looked down and saw a patch of disturbed earth, the soil dark and moist. Something gleamed in the flashlight's beam, a piece of metal, half buried. Donovan knelt, brushing away the dirt, and uncovered a locket, its surface tarnished but recognizable. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling, and found a photograph inside. It was a picture of a young woman with long, dark hair and a faint, almost sad smile. Donovan didn't recognize her, but he knew she was important. The locket was a clue, a piece of the puzzle, and he pocketed it, determined to find out more. The sound of footsteps behind him made him freeze, his hand instinctively going to his holster. He turned slowly, his flashlight cutting through the fog, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. The man was tall, his face obscured by the hood of a dark coat, but his presence was unmistakable, a cold, menacing energy that sent a shiver down Donovan's spine. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the encounter hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Then the man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here, detective." Donovan's grip tightened on his flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The man tilted his head, as if considering the question, but didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements deliberate, almost languid. Donovan raised his gun, but the man didn't flinch. "You've been following my trail," the man said, his tone almost conversational. "But you're not ready to see what lies at the end of it." Donovan's finger hovered over the trigger, his mind racing. Was this the killer? Or just another pawn in the game? The man stopped a few feet away, his hood still pulled low, his face hidden in shadow. The symbol is just the beginning, he said, his voice carrying an eerie, almost hypnotic quality. It's a doorway, a way to see the truth. But you'll need to open your eyes first. Donovan's hand shook, his finger twitching on the trigger, but he didn't shoot. Something about the man's calm demeanor unnerved him, made him hesitate. What truth? He asked, his voice tight with tension. The man chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill through the air. The truth about this town, he said. The truth about yourself. Before Donovan could respond, the man turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the fog. Donovan called after him, his voice desperate, but there was no answer. He hesitated, torn between giving chase and staying put, but in the end, he stayed. The man had been too confident, too prepared, and Donovan knew he was walking into a trap. He holstered his gun and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The encounter had shaken him, but it had also given him something, a direction, a purpose. The killer was leading him somewhere, and Donovan had no choice but to follow. The Black Hollow Library was an ancient building, its stone walls weathered by decades of neglect and decay. It stood at the edge of town, a relic of a bygone era, its windows clouded with grime and its doors warped from years of exposure to the elements. Donovan had passed it countless times but never ventured inside. Now, driven by the encounter in the woods and the locket he had found, he felt compelled to explore its shadowy depths. The library held secrets. He was sure of its secrets that might help him understand the symbol and the killer's motives. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door, a gust of musty air greeted him, carrying the scent of old paper and dust. The interior was dim, the sunlight filtering weakly through the grimy windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Shelves lined the walls, their contents obscured by layers of dust and cobwebs. Donovan stepped inside, his footsteps echoing on the creaking floorboards, and felt a strange sense of unease. The library felt alive, its silence heavy with the weight of forgotten stories and buried truths. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He began with the town's historical records, paging through brittle documents and yellowed newspapers that chronicled Black Hollow's past. The town had a dark history, one marked by tragedy and violence, but nothing seemed connected to the symbol or the recent murders. Frustrated, Donovan turned to the library's collection of rare books, searching for anything related to ancient symbols, occult practices, or folklore. The books were old, their leather bindings cracked and faded, but they were meticulously organized, a testament to the care of a long-forgotten librarian. Hours passed, and the light outside began to fade, casting the library into even deeper shadow. Donovan worked by the light of a single flickering bulb, his eyes strained and his back aching from hours of poring over dusty volumes. He found references to symbols similar to the one carved into the victims, but nothing exact. The closest match was a symbol from an ancient pagan cult, said to represent sacrifice and purification. According to the text, the cult had existed centuries ago but had been eradicated by a wave of religious persecution. Its remnants had vanished, leaving behind only rumors and legends. As Donovan read, a thought occurred to him: what if the cult hadn't disappeared entirely? What if it had gone underground, surviving in secret, passing its knowledge from generation to generation? The idea sent a chill down his spine, but it also made sense. The killer's actions weren't random. They were part of a pattern, a ritual, and the symbol was the key to understanding it. He needed to learn more about the cult, its practices, and its connection to Black Hollow. But the library's resources were limited, and time was running out. He turned to the library's map collection, unfolding ancient parchments that depicted the town and its surrounding areas in intricate detail. One map, in particular, caught his eye. It showed the location of an old settlement deep in the woods, a place marked by a strange symbol, a circle with intersecting lines, strikingly similar to the one carved into the victims. The settlement had been abandoned long ago, its name erased from history, but its location was clear. Donovan felt a surge of excitement. This was it, the place the killer had been leading him to. Donovan carefully copied the map's details, his hands trembling with anticipation. He knew it was dangerous to venture into the woods alone, especially after his encounter with the hooded figure, but he had no choice. The killer was taunting him, testing him, and he had to prove he was willing to follow the trail to its end. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, a sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on the floor above. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, and looked up at the ceiling, his mind racing. He wasn't alone. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and Donovan's hand instinctively went to his holster. He moved cautiously toward the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest, his senses on high alert. The second floor was even darker than the first, its shadows thick and impenetrable. He shone his flashlight ahead, the beam cutting through the gloom, but there was nothing there, no one, no source of the sound. The library was empty, its silence almost oppressive, but Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned to leave, eager to escape the library's eerie atmosphere, when something caught his eye, a book lying open on one of the tables. It hadn't been there before, he was sure of it. He approached cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the pages. The text was handwritten, the ink faded with age, but the words were clear. It was a journal, its entries detailing the history of the pagan cult and its connection to Black Hollow. According to the writer, the cult had not been eradicated but had retreated to the hidden settlement in the woods, where it continued its rituals in secret. Donovan's hands trembled as he read, the journal's words confirming his worst fears. The cult had thrived in the shadows, its members passing down their knowledge and traditions through the generations. The symbol was central to their practices, a mark of their devotion. But there was more, an entry that described a ritual, a sacrifice meant to purify the town and bring it back into balance. The writer had been a member of the cult but had turned against it, documenting its secrets in the hope of stopping it. The journal ended abruptly, its final pages torn out, leaving Donovan with more questions than answers. He pocketed the journal, his mind reeling with the implications. The killer wasn't acting alone. He was part of something larger, something ancient and deeply rooted in Black Hollow's history. But why now? What had triggered the killings after all these years? Donovan didn't know, but he was determined to find out. The library had given him a direction, a path to follow, and he wasn't going to stop until he had uncovered the truth. As he left the building, the fog seemed to close in around him, a shroud of mystery and danger that followed him into the night. The woods outside Black Hollow were eerily quiet, the fog thick and impenetrable, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Donovan moved cautiously, the map clutched tightly in his hand, his eyes scanning the shadowy trees for any sign of the path. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the scent of pine and decay. His footsteps were careful, deliberate, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound breaking the silence. He felt as though the trees were watching him, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, trying to bar his way. The journey was slow, the terrain uneven and treacherous, but Donovan pressed on, driven by a mix of determination and unease. The journal he had found in the library weighed heavily in his pocket, its words echoing in his mind. The cult had been real, its existence confirmed by the journal's chilling entries. Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. The killer was leading him somewhere, and he had to follow, no matter the cost. The map pointed to a clearing deep in the woods, and Donovan was determined to find it. Hours passed, the fog growing thicker and the forest darker, until Donovan finally reached the edge of the clearing. It was exactly as the map had described, a circle of trees surrounding an open space, its center dominated by a crumbling stone altar. The symbol was there, carved deep into the altar's surface, its lines sharp and precise despite the weathering of time. Donovan stepped into the clearing, his flashlight cutting through the fog, and felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the place, something ancient and malevolent, that made his skin crawl. The air was unnaturally still, the silence almost oppressive, as Donovan approached the altar. The ground around it was littered with charred wood and ashes, remnants of long-dead fires. He knelt, brushing aside the debris, and found more carvings, runes, and symbols etched into the stone, their meanings unclear but undeniably sinister. The cult had been here, performing its rituals, and the evidence of its presence was everywhere. Donovan's heart raced as he examined the altar, the weight of its history pressing down on him. This was the heart of the mystery, place where it all began. As he stood, a rustling sound came from the edge of the clearing, and Donovan turned, his flashlight cutting through the fog. The beam of light caught a figure, a man, tall and hooded, standing just inside the tree line. It was the same man he had encountered in the woods days before, his presence just as menacing as before. Donovan's hand went to his holster, but the man didn't move. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable, before the man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You've come far, detective, but you're still missing the bigger picture." Donovan's grip on his flashlight tightened, his voice sharp with frustration. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man tilted his head, as if considering the question, but didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the clearing, his movements slow and deliberate. "The symbol is more than just a mark," he said, his tone almost conversational. "It's a way of seeing, of understanding. But you're still blind, detective. You're looking for answers in the wrong places." Donovan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the man's words, but he couldn't find the thread. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. The man stopped a few feet away, his face still hidden in shadow. "I want you to see," he said, his voice carrying an eerie, almost hypnotic quality. "To understand what's at stake. Black Hollow is a wound, festering with corruption and decay, and the symbol is the key to cleansing it." Donovan shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You're talking in riddles," he snapped. "If you know something, say it. Stop playing games." The man chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill through the air. "The games are just beginning, detective. You'll need to prove yourself if you want to see the truth." Before Donovan could respond, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog. Donovan called after him, his voice desperate, but there was no answer. He hesitated, torn between giving chase and staying put, but in the end, he stayed. The man had been too confident, too prepared, and Donovan knew he was walking into a trap. He holstered his gun and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The encounter had shaken him, but it had also given him something, a direction, a purpose. The killer was leading him somewhere, and Donovan had no choice but to follow. He resumed his search of the clearing, his flashlight illuminating every inch of the altar and the surrounding area. Beneath the ashes, he found more artifacts, crude tools, fragments of pottery, and even bones, their presence a grim reminder of the rituals performed here. The journal had mentioned sacrifices, and the evidence confirmed it. Donovan's stomach turned as he examined the bones, their age and condition suggesting they had been there for decades, if not longer. The cult had been active for generations, its practices hidden from the outside world, but it had never truly disappeared. As Donovan sifted through the debris, his flashlight caught something glinting in the dirt, a piece of metal, its surface tarnished but recognizable. He picked it up, brushing away the dirt, and realized it was another locket, identical to the one he had found in the woods. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling, and found a photograph inside. It was the same woman from the previous locket, her expression just as haunting. Donovan's heart raced as he studied the photo. Who was she? And why did she keep appearing in places connected to the cult? He pocketed the locket, determined to find the answers. The fog began to lift as Donovan made his way out of the clearing, the sun breaking through the trees and casting long, golden rays across the forest floor. He felt a mix of relief and apprehension as he walked, his mind still reeling from the discoveries he had made. The cult was real, its presence in Black Hollow undeniable, but its connection to the killer was still unclear. Donovan knew he was missing something, a piece of the puzzle that would tie it all together. The journal, the locket, the altar, they were clues, but he needed more to understand the bigger picture. When Donovan finally emerged from the woods, the town of Black Hollow lay before him, its streets quiet and empty. He felt a strange sense of detachment as he walked through the town, the weight of what he had discovered pressing down on him. The killer was out there, watching him, testing him, and Donovan knew the next move was his. He had to piece together the clues, to understand the symbol and the cult's motives, before the killer struck again. But the answers seemed just out of reach, taunting him like a cruel joke. He returned to his office, the map and the journal spread out on his desk, and began to study them in detail. The hidden settlement was key, its existence proof of the cult's enduring presence, but Donovan knew there was more to it. The killer had been leading him there, showing him the altar and the symbols, but why? What was he trying to tell him? Donovan's mind raced as he pored over the evidence, trying to find the thread that connected it all. The pieces were there, but they didn't quite fit, and the frustration gnawed at him. As the day turned to night, Donovan's thoughts turned to the locket and the woman in the photograph. She was the missing link, the key to understanding the cult and its connection to the killer. He needed to find out who she was, what had happened to her, and why her image kept appearing in places connected to the murders. The answers were buried somewhere in Black Hollow's history, and Donovan was determined to uncover them. He picked up the phone, calling in favors and reaching out to contacts, determined to piece together the story. The hours passed in a blur, Donovan's focus unwavering as he worked. Slowly, the pieces began to come together, forming a picture that was as horrifying as it was fascinating. The woman in the photograph had been a member of the cult, a high priestess who had led its rituals and sacrifices. But something had happened, something that had turned her against the cult and led to her disappearance. The journal had been hers, and she had documented the cult's secrets in the hope of stopping it. But her efforts had failed, and the cult had survived, its legacy passed down through the generations. Donovan felt a surge of adrenaline as the truth began to dawn on him. The killer was connected to the cult, his motives tied to its rituals and beliefs. The symbol was a mark of his allegiance, a sign that he was carrying on the cult's legacy. But why now? What had triggered the killings after all these years? Donovan didn't know, but he was determined to find out. The woman in the photograph held the key, her story a piece of the puzzle that would unlock the mystery. Donovan had to find her, or at least learn what had happened to her, if he wanted to stop the killer. As the sun rose over Black Hollow, Donovan stared at the map and the journal, his mind sharp with focus. The killer was out there, watching him, testing him, but Donovan wasn't going to give up. The hunt was far from over, and he was willing to follow the trail to its end, no matter how dark or dangerous it became. The symbol was the key, and he was going to unlock its secrets, one way or another. The pieces were coming together, and Donovan knew he was close. The truth was just within reach. The photograph of the woman in the locket haunted Donovan, her faint, sad smile etched into his mind. He spent hours in his office, poring over old records and archives, searching for any trace of her identity. The Black Hollow Historical Society had a collection of photographs and documents, but most were poorly organized and covered in decades of dust. Donovan sifted through them meticulously, his frustration growing with each dead end. The woman had to be someone of importance. Her locket was too finely crafted, her image too deliberate, but her name and story remained elusive. As the hours turned into days, Donovan's search expanded beyond the archives. He interviewed the town's oldest residents, their memories foggy but occasionally illuminating. One name kept coming up: Eleanor Mercer, a woman who had lived in Black Hollow over 50 years ago. She had been beautiful, intelligent, and deeply connected to the town's history, but her life had ended in tragedy. The details were vague, the stories conflicting, but Donovan sensed he was on the right track. Eleanor Mercer was the woman in the photograph, and her story was the key to understanding the cult. Donovan's investigation led him to the outskirts of town, where a crumbling mansion stood isolated and forgotten. The Mercer estate had once been grand, a symbol of wealth and power, but now it was a shadow of its former self. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the walls covered in ivy and moss. Donovan approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the overgrown gravel path. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. The house felt alive, its emptiness heavy with unspoken secrets. Inside, the mansion was a labyrinth of dust-covered furniture, faded wallpaper, and broken chandeliers. Donovan moved through the rooms carefully, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He found old photographs and documents, their contents confirming his suspicions. Eleanor Mercer had lived here, and her life had been deeply intertwined with the cult. The journal he had found in the library was hers, her handwriting now unmistakable. She had been a high priestess, a leader of the cult's rituals and sacrifices, but something had changed. Her journal hinted at a betrayal, a moment of clarity that had led her to turn against the cult. As Donovan explored the mansion, he found a hidden door in the library, its presence betrayed by a faint creak underfoot. He pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The air grew colder as he descended, the walls damp and rough to the touch. At the bottom, he found a hidden room, its contents a chilling reminder of the cult's practices. The walls were covered in carvings, runes, symbols, and depictions of rituals, and the center of the room was dominated by an altar, its surface stained with something dark and dried. Donovan's stomach turned as he realized the implications. Eleanor had conducted rituals here, her home a sanctuary for the cult. Among the artifacts in the hidden room, Donovan found another journal, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling, and began to read. The entries detailed Eleanor's growing disillusionment with the cult, her realization that its practices were corrupt and destructive. She had tried to leave, to expose the cult's secrets, but they had turned on her. The final entry was a desperate plea, a warning to anyone who might find the journal. She had hidden evidence of the cult's crimes, hoping to bring it down, but feared she wouldn't survive long enough to see it done. Donovan's heart ached as he read her words, her courage and despair palpable. Donovan pocketed the journal, his mind racing with the implications. Eleanor Mercer had been a victim as much as a perpetrator, her life destroyed by the cult's influence. Her story was a tragedy, but it was also a clue the cult had survived her betrayal, its legacy carried on by its members. The killer was connected to this history, his motives tied to the cult's rituals and beliefs. Donovan needed to find the evidence Eleanor had hidden, to uncover the truth she had died trying to reveal. It was the only way to stop the killer and end the cycle of violence. As Donovan left the mansion, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He had uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle, but the answers he sought were still out of reach. The killer was watching him, testing him, and Donovan knew he had to act fast. The next step was clear: he had to find the evidence Eleanor had hidden, to use it against the cult and the killer. But he wasn't sure where to look. The journal had mentioned a safe place, somewhere the cult wouldn't think to search, but the details were vague. Donovan needed to think like Eleanor, to retrace her steps and follow her lead. The sun was setting as Donovan returned to his office, the journal and locket laid out on his desk. He studied them carefully, his mind sharp with focus. The locket was the key, its significance tied to Eleanor's story. She had carried it with her, a symbol of her past and her hope for redemption. Donovan turned it over in his hands, examining every detail, until he noticed something he had missed before: a tiny engraving on the back, barely visible to the naked eye. It was a set of numbers, their meaning unclear but undoubtedly important. Donovan's heart raced as he realized it might be a code, a clue to finding the evidence. Using the numbers as a guide, Donovan began to piece together the possible locations where Eleanor might have hidden the evidence. The journal had mentioned a safe place, somewhere the cult wouldn't think to search, and the numbers seemed to point to a specific location. Donovan cross-referenced them with old maps of Black Hollow, his frustration growing as he struggled to find a match. The hours passed in a blur, his focus unwavering, until he finally saw the connection. The numbers corresponded to a set of coordinates, leading to a spot deep in the woods. Donovan's heart pounded as he realized the significance of the coordinates. The hidden settlement in the woods, the place where the cult had performed its rituals, was the key. Eleanor had hidden the evidence there, in the heart of the cult's domain, knowing they would never think to look. It was a bold move, a testament to her courage and resourcefulness, and it was exactly where Donovan needed to go. He grabbed his flashlight and jacket, his mind made up. The next step was clear. He had to return to the woods, to find the evidence and confront the killer. The night was dark and frigid as Donovan ventured into the woods once more, the coordinates guiding his path. The fog had returned, thicker than before, and the trees seemed to close in around him. His flashlight cut through the gloom, the beam of light his only companion in the oppressive darkness. He moved cautiously, his senses on high alert, the journal and locket tucked safely in his pocket. The killer was out there, watching him, but Donovan didn't care. He was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. When Donovan finally reached the coordinates, he found himself standing at the edge of a shallow ravine. The ground was soft and muddy, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. He scanned the area with his flashlight, searching for any sign of the evidence Eleanor had hidden. At first, he saw nothing, just trees and undergrowth, but then his light caught something glinting in the dirt. He knelt, brushing away the mud, and uncovered a metal box, its surface rusted but intact. His hands trembled as he pried it open, revealing a collection of documents, photographs, and artifacts. The contents of the box were a treasure trove of evidence, detailing the cult's crimes and its members' identities. There were photographs of rituals, lists of names, and even confessions from former members. Donovan's heart raced as he realized the significance of what he had found. This was the proof he needed to expose the cult and stop the killer. Eleanor had risked everything to hide this evidence, and now it was in his hands. He felt a surge of gratitude and respect for her, her courage a beacon in the darkness. As Donovan gathered the evidence, a sound broke the silence, a low, guttural laugh that sent a chill through the air. He turned, his flashlight cutting through the fog, and saw the hooded figure standing at the edge of the ravine. The man's presence was unmistakable, his cold, menacing energy suffocating. "You've found it," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you're still missing the bigger picture, detective." Donovan's hand went to his holster, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's over," he said, his voice steady. "The evidence is here. I'm going to bring you down." The man laughed again, the sound echoing through the woods. "You think this is about justice? About stopping me? You're wrong, detective. This is about balance, about cleansing the corruption that festers in this town. The symbol is the key, and you've only just begun to understand its power." Before Donovan could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the fog, leaving him alone with the evidence and the weight of his decision. The killer was still out there, but Donovan had the tools to stop him. The hunt was far from over, but the end was in sight. The evidence from Eleanor Mercer's hidden box was spread across Donovan's desk, its contents a damning indictment of the cult and its crimes. Photographs of rituals, handwritten confessions, and lists of names painted a horrifying picture of the group's history and its enduring influence. Donovan studied the documents with a mixture of fascination and dread, his mind racing to connect the pieces. The cult had been active for generations, its members embedded in every corner of Black Hollow's society, their actions shielded by secrecy and fear. The killer was part of this shadowy network, but Donovan still didn't know his identity or ultimate goal. As Donovan worked, he felt a growing sense of urgency, the killer's taunts echoing in his mind. The man had spoken of balance and cleansing, his words cryptic but undeniably ominous. The symbol, the sacrifices, the rituals, it all pointed to a larger plan, one that Donovan was only beginning to understand. He needed to act fast, to use the evidence to expose the cult and stop the killer before it was too late. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. The cult's influence ran deep, and the killer was always one step ahead. The next morning, Donovan called a meeting with the town's mayor and the local police chief, determined to share what he had learned. The evidence was laid out before them, but their reactions were not what he had hoped for. The mayor, a middle-aged man with a perpetually weary expression, looked visibly uncomfortable, while the police chief, a gruff veteran with decades of service, dismissed the findings as circumstantial. "This is all old history," the chief said, his tone dismissive. "We don't have the resources to chase ghosts, Donovan. Focus on the present." Donovan's frustration boiled over, his voice sharp with anger. "This isn't history, it's happening now. The killer is connected to this cult, and he's using their rituals to justify his actions. If we don't stop him, more people will die." The mayor and the police chief exchanged uneasy glances, but they remained unmoved. "We'll look into it," the mayor said, his tone placating. "But we can't act on speculation. Bring us something concrete, and we'll take it from there." Donovan left the meeting seething, his faith in the system shattered. If the authorities wouldn't help, he would have to take matters into his own hands. That evening, Donovan returned to his office, his mind racing with possibilities. The evidence pointed to the cult's continued existence, its members hiding in plain sight, but identifying them was a daunting task. The list of names in Eleanor's box was a starting point, but many were decades old, their relevance unclear. Donovan began cross-referencing the names with current residents of Black Hollow, his focus sharp and unrelenting. Hours passed in a blur, the office quiet except for the sound of papers rustling and the hum of the computer. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Several descendants of the original cult members still lived in town, their lives seemingly ordinary but potentially hiding darker secrets. As Donovan worked, he received a call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice on the other end was distorted, robotic, but the message was clear. "You're getting too close, detective. Back off, or you'll regret it." The line went dead before Donovan could respond, leaving him alone in the silence of his office. The threat was unmistakable, but it only strengthened his resolve. The killer was afraid, and that meant Donovan was on the right track. He wouldn't be intimidated, not now, not when he was so close to the truth. The next day, Donovan began reaching out to the descendants on his list, approaching them under the guise of routine police work. Many were evasive, their answers guarded, but one name stood out: Thomas Greaves, a retired schoolteacher who lived on the edge of town. Greaves's grandfather had been a prominent member of the cult, and Donovan had a hunch that the man knew more than he was letting on. He drove to Greaves's house, a modest bungalow surrounded by overgrown bushes and a rusting fence. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, the atmosphere heavy with unease. Donovan knocked on the door, his hand hovering near his holster as he waited. The man who answered was in his 70s, with thinning gray hair and a face lined with age. He looked at Donovan with a mixture of surprise and apprehension, his eyes darting nervously. "Can I help you, detective?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Donovan showed his badge and explained that he was following up on an old case, watching the man's reaction carefully. Greaves hesitated, his hands shaking, before inviting Donovan inside with a reluctant nod. The interior of the house was cluttered, filled with old books, photographs, and trinkets from another era. Greaves led Donovan to a small sitting room, offering him a seat and a glass of water. Donovan accepted politely, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might hint at the man's connection to the cult. Greaves sat across from him, his face pale and drawn, his fingers fidgeting nervously. "What can I do for you, detective?" he asked again, his tone uneasy. Donovan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'm investigating some old crimes connected to your family. I think you know something about them." Greaves's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face turned ashen, and he began to stammer, his words tumbling out in a jumbled mess. I don't know anything about that, he said, his voice shaking. It was all so long ago. My grandfather, he was a troubled man, but that's in the past. Donovan pressed him, his tone firm but not unkind. Mr. Greaves, this isn't about the past anymore. People are dying, and I think the cult is behind it. If you know something, now's the time to tell me. Greaves looked visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he reached for his glass of water. He took a shaky sip, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, after a long silence, Greaves spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. My grandfather. He was a monster. He did terrible things, and he made sure our family never forgot. I've tried to move on, to leave it all behind, but it's not that easy. The cult, it's still out there, detective. They're watching, always watching. And if they find out I've talked to you, his voice trailed off, his face a mask of fear. Donovan leaned in, his tone urgent. Who's still active? Who's behind the killings? Greaves hesitated, his breathing shallow, before finally admitting, it's not one person. It's a group, a council. They meet in secret, and they decide who's next. Donovan felt a surge of adrenaline as the pieces began to fall into place. The killer wasn't working alone, he was part of a larger organization, a council that had been operating in the shadows for decades. Greaves's confirmation was the break Donovan needed, but it came at a cost. The man's fear was palpable, his hands shaking as he spoke. You need to leave now, Greaves said, his voice desperate. If they find out I've talked to you, they'll kill me. They'll kill both of us. Donovan nodded, his mind racing. He had the information he needed, but he couldn't risk putting Greaves in further danger. As Donovan left the house, he felt a strange mix of triumph and unease. He finally had a lead, a clear path forward, but the stakes were higher than ever. The cult's council was out there, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He couldn't afford to be reckless, to act without a plan. The evidence Eleanor had hidden was the key, and he needed to use it wisely. But time was running out, the killer was getting bolder, and Donovan knew the next move was his. He had to expose the council, to bring them into the light, but he couldn't do it alone. That night, Donovan returned to his office, the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. He spread the evidence across his desk, his mind sharp with focus. The list of names, the photographs, the confessions, they were pieces of a puzzle that had haunted Black Hollow for generations. He needed to connect them, to find the thread that would unravel the council's network. As he worked, he thought of Eleanor Mercer, her courage and sacrifice a guiding light in the darkness. She had risked everything to expose the cult, and now it was his turn to finish what she had started. The hours blurred together as Donovan pieced together the information, his focus unwavering. Slowly, a picture began to emerge: the council's members, their roles, and their connections to the town. It was a web of influence and corruption, its roots buried deep in Black Hollow's history. Donovan felt a surge of determination as he realized the scope of the task before him. The council was powerful, but they were also vulnerable. Their secrecy was their greatest strength, but it was also their weakness. If he could expose them, if he could prove their crimes, he could bring them down. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Donovan sat back, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but his mind sharp with resolve. He had a plan, a risky, dangerous plan, but it was the only way. He would gather the evidence, confront the council, and expose them to the world. It was a daunting task, but he had no choice. The killer was out there, and more lives were at stake. Donovan knew he was walking into the lion's den, but he was ready. The breaking point was here, and he wasn't going to back down. The council's existence weighed heavily on Donovan's mind, its shadow looming over every step he took. He had spent days meticulously piecing together the evidence, mapping out the names and connections of its members. The list he had compiled was disturbingly long. each name representing a person who had contributed to the cult's enduring power. Some were prominent figures in Black Hollow: business owners, local officials, even a few police officers, while others were ordinary citizens living seemingly ordinary lives. Donovan knew that exposing them wouldn't be easy. The council was deeply entrenched, its influence woven into the fabric of the town. One name stood out among the rest: Victor Hargrave, a wealthy landowner and philanthropist who was beloved by the community. Hargrave's family had lived in Black Hollow for generations, their wealth and power undeniable. Donovan had met him once, years ago, at a charity event, and had been struck by the man's charisma and charm. Now, as he studied the evidence, Hargrave's involvement in the cult became painfully clear. He wasn't just a member, he was the council's leader, the one who had kept the cult alive and hidden for decades. Donovan knew that confronting Hargrave would be the most dangerous step yet, but it was also the most necessary. Early the next morning, Donovan drove to the Hargrave estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town. The property was surrounded by high stone walls and wrought iron gates, its grandeur a stark contrast to the decay that haunted Black Hollow. As Donovan approached the gate, he felt a surge of apprehension. He had no warrant, no official backing, just his badge, his determination, and the evidence he had gathered. The gate was locked, but he pressed the intercom button, his heart pounding as he waited for a response. A voice crackled through the speaker, cold and impersonal. "State your business." Donovan identified himself, his voice firm despite his nerves. "I need to speak with Victor Hargrave. It's urgent." There was a long pause, followed by the sound of the gate unlocking. The voice on the intercom returned, its tone unchanged. "Proceed to the main house. Mr. Hargrave will see you." Donovan stepped through the gate, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding, the air filled with an oppressive silence. Donovan walked up the path, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, his senses on high alert. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he knew he couldn't turn back. The door opened as Donovan approached, revealing a tall, gaunt man in a tailored suit. His eyes were cold and calculating, his expression unreadable. "Detective Donovan," the man said, his tone polite but distant. "Mr. Hargrave is expecting you." Donovan followed him into the mansion, his eyes scanning the opulent interior. The walls were lined with portraits of the Hargrave family, their faces stern and unyielding, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and old money, the silence broken only by the sound of his footsteps on the marble floor. The man led him to a large study, where Victor Hargrave sat behind a massive oak desk, his presence commanding and imposing. Hargrave looked up as Donovan entered, his expression calm but curious. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair and sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "Detective Donovan," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Donovan stepped forward, his gaze steady. "I'm here to ask you about the council," he said, his voice firm despite the tension in the room. Hargrave's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or amusement. "The council?" he repeated, his tone mild. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Donovan placed the evidence on the desk, the photographs, the list of names, the journal, and watched Hargrave's reaction carefully. The man's calm demeanor didn't waver, but his eyes darkened as he studied the documents. "This is all very interesting," he said after a long silence, his tone still calm. "But I fail to see its relevance. What is it you're accusing me of, detective?" Donovan leaned forward, his voice sharp with determination. "I'm accusing you of being the leader of a cult that has been killing people in this town for decades. I'm accusing you of orchestrating these crimes, of using your power to cover them up." Hargrave's smile was icy, his eyes narrowing as he leaned back in his chair. "You're making some very serious accusations," he said, his voice cold. "But you have no proof, no authority to back them up. I suggest you leave now, before this conversation goes any further. Donovan held his gaze, refusing to back down. I have enough proof to bring you down, he said, his voice steady. And I'm not leaving until you answer for what you've done. Hargrave's expression hardened, his politeness giving way to something darker, more dangerous. You're playing a dangerous game, detective, he said, his voice low and menacing. One you're not prepared to win. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Donovan's hand hovered near his holster, his instincts screaming at him to be ready. Hargrave's mask had slipped, revealing the predatory nature beneath, and Donovan knew he was in dangerous territory. You're wrong, he said, his voice firm. This isn't a game. People are dying, and I'm going to stop it with or without your cooperation. Hargrave's lips curled into a cold smile, his eyes gleaming with malice. You're more naive than I thought, detective. The council is larger than you can imagine, its influence more pervasive. You'll never stop us. Before Donovan could respond, the tall man who had let him in stepped into the room, his presence menacing. Hargrave gestured toward Donovan, his tone dismissive. Escort the detective out, he said, his voice cold, and make sure he understands the consequences of overstepping. Donovan was ushered out of the study, his mind racing with the implications of the conversation. He had confirmed Hargrave's involvement, but he had also exposed himself to the council's wrath. They knew he was onto them, and that made him a target. As he was led out of the mansion, he felt a sense of unease, the weight of the council's shadow pressing down on him. The gate closed behind him with a loud clang, the sound reverberating in the stillness of the morning. Donovan stood outside for a moment, his mind sharp with focus. He had to act fast. The council would be watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He couldn't give them the chance. The evidence he had gathered was strong, but he needed more to bring them down. He needed witnesses, collaborators willing to speak out against the council. It was a daunting task, but Donovan knew it was the only way. The council's power lay in its secrecy, and he had to shatter that secrecy to destroy it. Donovan returned to his office, his thoughts consumed by the meeting with Hargrave. The man's arrogance was infuriating, but it also revealed a weakness, his confidence that the council was untouchable. Donovan knew that arrogance could be exploited, that it could lead to mistakes. He began reaching out to the descendants on his list, pushing harder for information, determined to find someone willing to talk. Many refused, their fear of the council evident, but one name stood out: Anna Greaves, Thomas's granddaughter. She was young, idealistic, and had no connection to the cult. Donovan hoped she might be willing to help. That evening, Donovan met Anna at a small cafe on the edge of town, the dim lighting and quiet atmosphere providing a measure of privacy. She was in her mid-20s, with sharp features and a determined expression, but her eyes betrayed her nervousness. "You wanted to talk about my grandfather," she said, her voice cautious. Donovan nodded, his tone calm and reassuring. "I know this is difficult, but I need your help. The council is still active, and they're hurting people. Your grandfather knew about them, and I think you do too." Anna hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee cup. "I don't know much," she admitted, "but I know they're dangerous. If they find out I've talked to you..." Donovan leaned forward, his voice urgent. "They won't," he said, "but I need your help to stop them. You're one of the few people who can do that." Anna looked at him for a long moment, her fear warring with her sense of justice, before finally nodding. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Donovan felt a surge of relief, his determination renewed. "I need you to testify," he said, "to tell the truth about what you know. It's the only way to bring them down." Anna hesitated again, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but she finally agreed. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "But you have to protect me. They'll come after me if they find out." Donovan nodded, his heart racing with the weight of the moment. He had a witness, someone willing to stand against the council, but the danger was far from over. The council's shadow loomed over Black Hollow, its influence as pervasive as ever, but Donovan knew he was closer than ever to breaking it. As he left the cafe, he felt a sense of grim determination. The next step was clear. He had to gather the evidence, prepare the case, and expose the council to the world. It was a daunting task, but he had no choice. The breaking point was here, and he wasn't going to back down. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale light over the small, sleepy town of Millwood. Nestled in the heart of the Midwest, Millwood was the kind of place where nothing ever happened until that morning. The townsfolk awoke to the distant sound of a steam engine chugging along the old railway tracks that had been abandoned for decades. The train was pulling a caravan of dusty, weathered wagons, each emblazoned with faded, peeling letters that spelled out "Nocturnal Circus of Wonders." The arrival of the circus was a spectacle in itself. No one had seen anything like it in years. The circus set up on the outskirts of town, in a field that had long been overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. Despite the early hour, a small crowd began to gather, drawn by the novelty of the event. The caravans were unlike anything the townspeople had ever seen. The wagons were painted in garish colors that had once been vibrant but now seemed faded and almost ghostly. The carriages were adorned with intricate, macabre carvings of grinning clowns, leering animals, and distorted, otherworldly figures. There was something unsettling about the way the images seemed to shift when you looked at them for too long. The workers, dressed in tattered, mismatched clothing, moved with an eerie synchronicity, as if they were part of some strange, choreographed dance. They set up the carousel, the Ferris wheel, and the big top tent with unnerving efficiency. The townspeople watched in a mix of awe and unease, their murmurs growing louder as the circus took shape. Many of the workers avoided eye contact, their faces obscured by hoods or shadows, but one figure stood out from the rest, a clown, tall and lanky, with a painted smile that seemed too wide, too unnatural. The clown, who introduced himself as Grins, was the first to address the crowd. His voice was high-pitched and grating, yet it carried an odd, hypnotic quality. He welcomed the townsfolk to the Nocturnal Circus of Wonders, promising a night of marvels and mysteries that they would never forget. His eyes, however, told a different story. Cold, calculating, they scanned the crowd as if searching for something or someone. The children were captivated by him, their laughter ringing out, but the adults exchanged uneasy glances, their instincts screaming that something was off. As the day wore on, the circus became the talk of the town. The big top tent stood tall and imposing, its red and white stripes now dulled by time and weather. The air around the circus grounds seemed heavier, as if charged with an unseen energy. A faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, making the hair on the back of people's necks stand on end. Despite these strange sensations, the promise of entertainment was too tempting to resist, and by nightfall, the circus was packed with eager townsfolk. The first show began with a fanfare of discordant, off-key music played by a band of performers whose instruments looked as ancient as the wagons. The crowd filed into the big top tent, the dim lighting casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The performances were mesmerizing. Acrobats twisted in unnatural positions, fire eaters breathed flames that seemed to dance with a life of their own, and magicians performed tricks that defied explanation. But there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that made the audience's applause falter at times. Grins took center stage, his presence dominating the tent. His act involved a series of illusions that left the audience both amazed and unnerved. He pulled flowers from thin air, but the petals were black and withered. He produced doves that fluttered briefly before vanishing in puffs of smoke that smelled faintly of sulfur. The climax of the act involved a young volunteer, a boy from the town who Grins made disappear in a cloud of glittering dust. The boy reappeared moments later, seemingly unharmed, but his eyes were distant, his smile unervingly similar to Grins. As the show ended, The crowd dispersed, their chatter filled with a mix of excitement and unease. Children couldn't stop talking about the wonders they had seen, but the parents exchanged worried glances. Something about the circus felt wrong, but none could quite put their finger on it. The clown's painted smile lingered in their minds, a haunting image that wouldn't fade. Late that night, as the town slept, strange noises emanated from the circus grounds. Faint, echoing laughter drifted on the wind, and shadows moved in ways that defied logic. The faint hum grew louder, resonating deep within the bones of those who stirred in their beds. The circus seemed to come alive in the darkness, its true nature revealing itself to the empty streets and silent houses. The next morning, the town awoke to the news that 2 children were missing. The families searched frantically, their cries echoing through the streets, but there was no sign of them. The circus, however, remained as it was, its workers going about their business as if nothing had happened. The townsfolk converged on the circus grounds, demanding answers, but Grins and the others denied any involvement. In the days that followed, the tension in Millwood grew to a breaking point. The circus became both a source of fascination and fear, a place where the line between reality and illusion blurred. The missing children were never far from anyone's mind, and the clown's painted smile became a symbol of the town's growing dread. The circus had brought wonder, but it had also brought something far darker, something that would change Millwood forever. The days following the circus's arrival were fraught with an uneasy tension that hung over Millwood like a storm cloud. The initial excitement had curdled into suspicion, and whispers spread through the town like wildfire. The disappearance of the 2 children, a boy named Tommy and a girl named Emily, was all anyone could talk about. Their families were inconsolable, their cries echoing through the streets, while the townsfolk searched every corner of the town, their desperation growing with each passing hour. Yet, there was no trace of the children, as if they had vanished into thin air. The circus, however, remained untouched by the chaos. The workers went about their business with an eerie calm, setting up new attractions and rehearsing their acts as if nothing had happened. Grins, the clown, became a constant presence, his painted smile a stark contrast to the fear gripping the town. He wandered the streets, handing out flyers for the next show, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. The children were drawn to him like moths to a flame, their laughter ringing out as he performed tricks, but the adults kept their distance, their unease growing with each encounter. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Hank Thompson, led the search for the missing children. He was a no-nonsense lawman who had seen his fair share of trouble, but even he was shaken by the sudden disappearances. He questioned the circus workers, his sharp eyes scanning their faces for any hint of guilt, but they offered no answers. Their responses were rehearsed, their alibis airtight, and their demeanor unervingly calm. Hank left the circus grounds with a knot in his stomach, convinced that something was terribly wrong. As night fell, the town grew quiet, but the circus grounds buzzed with activity. The big top tent loomed against the darkened sky, its stripes barely visible in the dim light. Inside, the performers rehearsed their acts, their movements synchronized in a way that seemed almost unnatural. Grin stood at the center of the tent, his eyes fixed on a group of children who had sneaked in to watch. He beckoned them closer, his voice a whispered invitation that sent chills down their spines. The children hesitated, but curiosity got the better of them. The next morning, another child was reported missing, a girl named Lucy who had been seen talking to Grins the night before. Her parents were frantic, their cries piercing the morning air, but the circus workers denied any involvement. Grins, in particular, seemed unbothered, his painted smile never wavering. The townsfolk's fear turned to anger, and a mob began to gather outside the circus grounds, their voices rising in a chorus of accusations. Hank tried to calm them, but the tension was too great, and the mob demanded answers. In the chaos, a young man named Jack Thompson, the sheriff's nephew and a reporter for the local paper, arrived at the circus grounds. He had returned to Millwood after hearing about the disappearances, determined to uncover the truth. Jack was sharp-eyed and resourceful, with a knack for seeing through lies, and he immediately sensed that the circus was hiding something. He began to interview the townsfolk, piecing together the events leading up to the disappearances. But the more he learned, the more he realized how deeply the circus was intertwined with the town's growing dread. Jack decided to infiltrate the circus, posing as a musician looking for work. He was hired almost immediately, a fact that only deepened his suspicions. The workers were friendly but guarded, their conversations laced with cryptic remarks that hinted at a darker purpose. Jack spent his days rehearsing with the band, his eyes constantly scanning the circus grounds for any sign of the missing children. At night, he explored the circus, his footsteps silent on the dirt paths as he searched for clues. It didn't take long for Jack to notice something strange. The circus seemed larger at night, its attractions sprawling in ways that defied logic. The carousel's music played on a loop, its distorted melodies grating on his nerves, while the Ferris wheel's lights flickered ominously in the darkness. The big top tent seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its shadows shifting in ways that made Jack's skin crawl. He pressed on, determined to uncover the circus's secrets. One night, Jack stumbled upon a secluded area of the circus grounds, hidden behind a maze of wagons and caravans. There, he found a smaller tent, its entrance sealed with a heavy padlock. The air around it was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath his feet felt unervingly soft. Jack's heart raced as he forced the lock open, his hands trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. Inside, he found a collection of personal items, shoes, dolls, and clothing that belonged to the missing children. The discovery sent a chill down Jack's spine. He quickly gathered evidence, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he had found. The tent was a macabre shrine, its walls adorned with photographs of grins and the missing children. One photo, in particular, caught his eye, a faded image of grins standing beside a group of children from a different town, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Jack realized that the circus had a history, a pattern of disappearances that stretched back decades. As Jack left the tent, he caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. Grin stood nearby, his painted smile stretched impossibly wide, his eyes gleaming with malice. Jack's heart pounded as the clown approached, his footsteps silent on the dirt path. Grin's voice was a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down Jack's spine. "You shouldn't have come here," the clown said, his tone both menacing and amused. Jack backed away, his instincts screaming at him to run, but Grins was already closing in. In a desperate move, Jack grabbed a nearby shovel and swung it at Grins, the metal blade slicing through the air with a sharp whistle. The clown dodged with unnatural speed, his laughter ringing out as he vanished into the shadows. Jack stood there, his chest heaving, the weight of what he had discovered pressing down on him. He knew he had to act quickly before the circus claimed another victim. The next morning, Jack shared his findings with his uncle, Sheriff Thompson. The two men devised a plan to confront the circus, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. Grins was cunning, and the circus seemed almost impervious to outside interference. Jack returned to the circus that night, his resolve stronger than ever. He was determined to expose its secrets, no matter the cost. As the big top tent filled with spectators for the evening show, Jack slipped into the shadows, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of Grins. The show began with a fanfare of discordant music, the performers moving with a precision that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Grins took center stage once again, his act more chilling than ever. Jack watched as the clown selected another volunteer, a young boy from the audience, his heart pounding with dread. As Grins prepared to perform his final trick, Jack stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. He accused Grins of being behind the disappearances, his words ringing out in the hushed tent. The crowd turned to him, their expressions a mix of shock and fear. Grins' smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of pure malice. The two men locked eyes, their confrontation escalating into a tense standoff that would change the course of the night and the fate of the town. The air in the big top tent grew thick with tension as Jack's accusation hung in the silence. The crowd turned their eyes to Grins, their unease palpable. For a moment, The clown's painted smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of something darker: rage, perhaps, or malice. Jack stood his ground, his heart pounding but his voice steady as he repeated his claim, pointing to the evidence he had gathered. The townsfolk began to murmur, their fear and confusion mingling into a low, restless hum that filled the tent. Grins, ever the showman, raised his hands in mock surrender, his grin returning as he addressed the crowd. His voice was smooth, almost soothing, as he dismissed Jack's accusations as the ramblings of a jealous outsider. "The boy has an overactive imagination," Grin said, his tone dripping with condescension. The crowd hesitated, torn between their growing distrust of the clown and the spectacle he had provided them over the past few days. Jack clenched his fists, knowing he had to act quickly before Grins could charm his way out of trouble. Before Jack could respond, the tent's lights flickered and dimmed, plunging the space into an eerie half-light. Grin's figure seemed to grow taller, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the canvas walls. The crowd gasped, their fear reignited as the atmosphere shifted from tense to outright sinister. Jack stepped forward, his voice loud and clear as he urged the townsfolk to leave the tent. "This man is dangerous," he shouted, his words cutting through the rising panic. Some people began to move toward the exits, while others seemed frozen in place, their eyes locked on Grins. The clown's laughter echoed through the tent, a high-pitched, discordant sound that sent shivers down everyone's spines. "Why leave so soon?" Grins called out, his voice almost pleading, but his eyes gleamed with menace. He made a sweeping gesture with his hand, and the exits of the tent seemed to vanish, the flaps sealing shut as if by magic. The crowd erupted into chaos, their screams filling the air as they realized they were trapped. Jack's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay focused, scanning the tent for a way to help the townsfolk escape. Grins turned his attention back to Jack, his grin widening as he stepped closer. "You should have stayed out of this," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Jack backed away, his mind racing as he searched for a way to fight back. The clown's movements were unnaturally fluid, his presence almost hypnotic, but Jack refused to be intimidated. He glanced around, spotting a fire extinguisher mounted on one of the tent's support beams. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and swung it at Grins, the canister connecting with a sickening thud. The clown staggered back, his grin faltering for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his laughter ringing out once more. Jack swung again, this time aiming for the clown's legs, but Grins dodged with an agility that defied human capability. "You can't stop me," Grins taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. Jack gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the fire extinguisher as he prepared for another strike. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence, their fear momentarily overshadowed by the spectacle unfolding before them. In the chaos, Sheriff Thompson burst into the tent, his gun drawn and his face set in a grim expression. "Enough of this," he barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He aimed the gun at Grins, his eyes narrowed in determination. The clown turned to face the sheriff, his grin never wavering as he raised his hands in mock surrender. Now, Grin said, his tone almost playful. "There's no need for violence." The sheriff's finger hovered over the trigger, but before he could fire, the lights in the tent went out completely, plunging the space into total darkness. The sound of screams filled the air as the crowd panicked, their fear reaching a fever pitch. Jack felt a hand grab his arm, pulling him away from the chaos. It was the sheriff, his voice low and urgent as he guided Jack toward the tent's entrance. "We need to get out of here," the sheriff said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jack nodded, his heart pounding as they stumbled through the darkness, the sounds of the panicked crowd echoing around them. They reached the exit and burst out into the cool night air, the sight of the town's streets a welcome relief. But the relief was short-lived. As Jack and the sheriff turned back to the tent, they saw a figure standing in the entrance Grins, his silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. His grin was wider than ever, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "This isn't over," the clown said, his voice carrying a chilling finality. Before Jack or the sheriff could react, Grins turned and disappeared back into the tent, the flaps sealing shut behind him. The two men exchanged a grim look, knowing that the battle was far from won. The next morning, the townsfolk gathered in the town square, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. The events of the previous night had left them shaken, and the circus's influence seemed to hang over the town like a dark cloud. Sheriff Thompson addressed the crowd, his voice steady but grim as he outlined the plan to confront the circus once and for all. Jack stood beside him, his jaw set in determination. He knew that the clown's reign of terror had to end, no matter the cost. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the townsfolk formed a plan to confront the circus. Some volunteered to help the sheriff maintain order, while others prepared weapons or gathered supplies. Jack took the lead, his knowledge of the circus's layout proving invaluable. He described the smaller tent he had found, as well as the collection of personal items that belonged to the missing children. The townsfolk listened in stunned silence, their fear giving way to a steely resolve. By midday, a group of volunteers, led by Jack and the sheriff, approached the circus grounds. The big top tent stood ominously in the distance, its stripes a stark contrast to the clear blue sky. The circus workers were nowhere to be seen, their absence adding to the eerie atmosphere. Jack led the group toward the smaller tent, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. As they approached, the scent of decay grew stronger, and the soft ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. The tent's entrance was still sealed with the heavy padlock, but the sheriff quickly broke it open with a crowbar. Inside, the townsfolk gasped at the sight of the personal items, shoes, dolls, and clothing that belonged to the missing children. Jack pointed out the photographs on the walls, their faded images of Grins and past victims sending a chill through the group. The sheriff's face hardened as he took in the scene, his resolve strengthening with each passing moment. As they left the tent, Jack noticed movement in the distance, a figure watching them from the shadows. It was Grins, his painted smile visible even from afar. Jack's heart raced as he pointed the clown out to the sheriff, but before they could act, Grins disappeared into the maze of wagons and caravans. The group exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that the clown was still out there, waiting. Battle was far from over, and the town's survival depended on their ability to confront the darkness that had taken root in their midst. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town of Millwood as the group, led by Jack and Sheriff Thompson, prepared to confront the circus once and for all. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of dread that seemed to cling to every breath. The townsfolk had armed themselves with whatever they could find: pitchforks, shovels, and even a few hunting rifles, but their resolve wavered as they approached the eerie silence of the circus grounds. The big top tent loomed ahead, its stripes glowing faintly in the fading light, a beacon of both fascination and terror. Jack led the way, his heart pounding but his steps steady. He carried a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other, the weight of the latter a small comfort against the unknown. The circus workers were nowhere to be seen, the grounds eerily deserted as if the entire troop had vanished into thin air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of a wagon or the rustle of wind through the caravans. Jack's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, his instincts screaming that they were being watched. As they reached the center of the grounds, the group halted before the entrance of the big top tent. The flaps hung open, revealing a yawning darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Jack exchanged a glance with the sheriff, who nodded grimly before stepping forward. The rest of the group followed, their footsteps muffled by the sawdust-covered ground. Inside, the tent was cavernous, the air thick with the scent of damp soil and something metallic that made Jack's stomach churn. The faint hum that had haunted the town for days was louder here, a low, persistent vibration that seemed to resonate in their bones. The group fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched for any sign of Grins or the missing children. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the tent's supports. Jack's light fell on a cluster of objects near the center: ring, shoes, dolls, and clothing he recognized from the smaller tent. The items were arranged in a crude circle, as if part of some twisted ritual. The townsfolk murmured among themselves, their fear growing with each passing moment. Suddenly, the lights in the tent flickered on, bathing the space in a sickly yellow glow. The group tensed, their weapons raised as they scanned the area. Then, from the shadows, came the sound of laughter, low, guttural, and utterly devoid of mirth. Grin stepped into the light, his painted smile wide and unnerving, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing through the tent. "I've been expecting you." The townsfolk backed away, their fear palpable as the clown's presence filled the space. Jack stepped forward, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "Where are the children?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Grins tilted his head, his grin never wavering as he regarded Jack with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Close by," he replied, his tone almost conversational. "But you'll have to find them." The clown's words sent a chill through the group, the implication clear this was a game, and Grins was the only one who knew the rules. Before anyone could react, the tent's lights flickered again, plunging the space back into darkness. The sound of laughter echoed from all directions, disorienting the group as they scrambled to regroup. Jack fumbled with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness as he searched for Grins. The clown's voice carried on the air, taunting and disembodied, his laughter growing louder with each passing moment. "Come and find me," he called, his voice a sing-song whisper that sent shivers down their spines. The group moved cautiously through the tent, their flashlights dancing across the walls and seats as they searched for any sign of the clown. The scent of decay grew stronger, mingling with the metallic tang that hung in the air. Jack's light fell on a small door at the back of the tent, hidden behind a heavy curtain. He gestured to the sheriff, who nodded and followed as Jack pushed the door open. Inside, they found a narrow corridor lined with flickering lights and walls covered in photographed snapshots of Grins with children from towns long forgotten, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. At the end of the corridor was another door, this one slightly ajar. Jack pushed it open, his heart pounding as he stepped into a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with the scent of blood, the walls stained with dark, rust-colored smears. In the center of the room stood a crude altar, its surface covered in candles and what appeared to be remnants of dried blood. Jack's stomach turned as he realized what he was looking at, the heart of Grin's twisted ritual. Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. Jack fumbled with his flashlight, the beam revealing Grin standing before him, his grin impossibly wide, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. "You're too late," the clown whispered, his voice a guttural rasp. "The ritual is complete." Panic surged through Jack as he raised the crowbar, but Grins moved with inhuman speed, disarming him with a single, fluid motion. The clown's laughter filled the room, a high-pitched, discordant sound that made Jack's head spin. He backed away, his eyes darting around the room for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in around him. Grin stepped closer, his grin never wavering as he reached out with a gloved hand. Before he could make contact, the door burst open, and Sheriff Thompson charged into the room, his gun blazing. The shots echoed through the space, but Grins merely laughed, his body absorbing the bullets as if they were nothing. The sheriff's eyes widened in shock, but he quickly regained his composure, grabbing Jack and pulling him toward the exit. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, his voice urgent. Jack nodded, his legs moving as if on autopilot as they stumbled out of the room and back into the corridor. The laughter followed them, growing louder as they ran, the sound echoing in their ears long after they burst out of the tent and into the cool night air. The group regrouped outside, their faces pale and their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Jack turned to the sheriff, his voice trembling with fear and determination. "We need to destroy this place," he said, "before he can hurt anyone else." The sheriff nodded, his jaw set in grim resolve. The townsfolk rallied together, gathering whatever flammable materials they could find: gasoline, old rags, and wooden planks from the caravans. They worked quickly, their fear driving them as they prepared to set the circus ablaze. As the flames began to spread, the group watched from a safe distance, the fire illuminating their faces in flickering orange light. The big top tent was engulfed in moments, its canvas collapsing as the flames consumed it. The heat was intense, the air filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and fabric. Jack stood at the forefront, his eyes fixed on the inferno, a mixture of relief and dread churning in his gut. He knew this wasn't over. Grins was too cunning, too powerful, but for now, at least, the town was safe. As the fire raged on, a faint sound carried on the wind, a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers down their spines. Jack turned, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the flames, but there was nothing there. Still, the laughter lingered, a haunting reminder that some evils could never truly be extinguished. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of what they had witnessed settling over them like a suffocating blanket. The circus was gone, but the terror it had brought would linger in their minds for years to come. The fire burned through the night, consuming the circus in a blazing inferno that lit up the sky. The townsfolk watched in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and unease. The flames crackled and roared, throwing sparks into the air as the big top tent collapsed into a smoldering heap. The smell of burning wood and fabric mingled with the acrid scent of something far worse, a sickly sweetness that made Jack's stomach churn. He stood at the edge of the chaos, his eyes fixed on the flames, a sense of dread gnawing at the edges of his mind. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a scorched patch of earth and the twisted remains of the circus wagon. Townsfolk gathered around, their murmurs low and anxious as they surveyed the damage. Sheriff Thompson ordered a search of the ruins, hoping to find any trace of the missing children or Grins himself. Jack joined them, his boots crunching over the charred remains as he sifted through the debris. The air was thick with ash, the remnants of the circus's macabre history scattered across the ground like a blackened graveyard. Despite their thorough search, they found no sign of the clown. No bones, no artifacts, nothing to suggest Grins had been caught in the flames. Jack's unease deepened as he knelt beside a partially burned wagon, his fingers brushing against a faded carving of a grinning clown. The image seemed to shift as he touched it, the eyes narrowing into a sinister glare. Jack jerked his hand back, his heart pounding as he stumbled away from the wagon. The others noticed his distress but said nothing, their own fears mirrored in their haunted expressions. The days that followed were eerily quiet, the town of Millwood falling into an uneasy calm. The missing children were never found, their absence a painful wound that refused to heal. The townsfolk tried to move on, returning to their routines, but the shadow of the circus lingered. Strange occurrences began to plague the town: whispers in the night, fleeting glimpses of a figure with a painted smile, and the faint hum that had haunted them growing louder at times. Jack found himself on edge, jumping at every sound, his sleep plagued by nightmares of Grins and the burning circus. One evening, as Jack sat in his small apartment above the town's general store, he heard a knock at the door. He froze, his heart skipping a beat as he stared at the door. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Jack grabbed a nearby wrench, his hands trembling as he approached the door. He hesitated, then yanked it open, only to find an empty hallway. The air was cold, the faint scent of sulfur lingering in the air. Jack shivered, his grip tightening on the wrench as he scanned the darkened hallway. The next morning, Jack visited Sheriff Thompson, his face pale and his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He told the sheriff about the knocking and the strange occurrences, his voice low and urgent. The sheriff listened intently, his expression grim. "I've been hearing things too," he admitted, his tone heavy with concern. "Whispers in the night, footsteps where there shouldn't be. I don't think we've seen the last of that damn clown." Jack nodded, his stomach churning as the weight of the sheriff's words settled over him. The two men decided to investigate further, determined to uncover the truth about Grins and the circus. They began by interviewing the townsfolk. Their questions met with uneasy glances and hushed whispers. Many claimed to have seen grins in the shadows, his painted smile always just out of reach. Others spoke of strange noises, laughter echoing from empty buildings, the sound of a steam engine chugging in the distance. Jack and the sheriff pieced together the accounts, their fear growing with each new revelation. Their investigation led them to the town's archives, a dusty room filled with old newspapers and records. Jack and the sheriff spent hours combing through the documents, searching for any mention of the nocturnal circus of wonders. What they found shook them to their core. The circus had a history, one that stretched back decades and spanned multiple towns. Each place it visited was left scarred, plagued by disappearances and strange occurrences long after the circus had moved on. The accounts were eerily similar, the details repeating like a twisted pattern. One article, yellowed with age, caught Jack's attention. It described a town in Illinois where the circus had appeared in 1923, only to vanish overnight after a series of disappearances. The article included a photograph of the circus grounds, the same faded wagons and caravans Jack recognized from Millwood. Standing at the center of the photograph was Grins, his painted smile unmistakable. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized the truth: the clown wasn't just a man. He was something far older, far more sinister, and he had returned to Millwood for a reason. Jack and the sheriff confronted the mayor, presenting him with their findings. The man's face paled as he read the articles, his hands trembling as he set the papers down. This can't be real," he stammered, his voice thin with fear. Jack leaned forward, his tone urgent. "It's real, and it's happening again. We need to do something before it's too late." The mayor hesitated, his eyes darting between Jack and the sheriff, before finally nodding. He agreed to gather the townsfolk, to warn them of the danger, but even as he spoke, Jack could see the doubt in his eyes. The town hall meeting was tense, the air thick with fear and suspicion. Jack and the sheriff presented their findings, the townsfolk listening in stunned silence. When the presentation ended, the room erupted into chaos, voices rising in a cacophony of anger and fear. Some demanded answers, others called for action, but a few dismissed the claims as hysteria. Jack watched, his heart sinking as he realized the town was fractured, their unity shattered by the very evil they sought to fight. As the meeting disbanded, Jack and the sheriff remained behind, their heads bowed in grim contemplation. "We need to find a way to stop him," Jack said, his voice low and resolute. The sheriff nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We will," he replied, "but we'll need more than pitchforks and fire to take down something like that." Jack agreed, his mind racing as he tried to piece together a plan. The town's survival depended on their ability to confront the darkness, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Grins was always one step ahead. That night, as Jack lay in bed, he heard it again, a faint guttural laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He sat up, his heart pounding as he scanned the darkened room. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the air around him. Jack reached for the wrench on his bedside table, his hands trembling as he clutched it tightly. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice breaking the silence. The laughter ceased, replaced by a chilling whisper that sent shivers down his spine. "It's not over, Jack. It's never over." The next morning, Jack found Sheriff Thompson waiting for him outside his apartment, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot. "We need to act now," the sheriff said, his voice gravelly with urgency. Jack nodded, his resolve hardening as he realized the time for hesitation was over. The two men set out into the town, their steps quick and purposeful. They would confront Grins, no matter the cost, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the clown was waiting for them, his painted smile gleaming in the shadows. The fight for Millwood's soul was just beginning, and Jack knew it would take everything they had to survive. The town of Millwood had become a ghost of its former self, its streets eerily quiet as the inhabitants retreated indoors, haunted by the lingering presence of the nocturnal circus of wonders. Jack and Sheriff Thompson moved through the town with purpose, their boots crunching against the gravel as they headed toward the scorched remains of the circus grounds. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of charred wood and ash, a reminder of the fire that had failed to rid them of grins. Jack carried a backpack filled with supplies, flashlights, matches, and a few old books he had found in the archives, hoping they might contain some clue to defeating the clown. The sheriff clutched his rifle tightly, his knuckles white as he scanned the area for any sign of movement. As they approached the ruins, a faint hum began to resonate in the air, growing louder with each step. Jack's skin prickled as he recognized the sound, the same eerie vibration that had haunted the town for weeks. The scorched ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was alive with malevolent energy. The sheriff muttered a curse under his breath, his eyes darting around the perimeter. "Stay sharp," he warned, his voice low and tense. Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the crowbar he had brought as a makeshift weapon. They stepped into the ruins, their flashlights cutting through the ash-choked air. The remains of the big top tent lay in a twisted heap, its charred fabric fluttering in the breeze like the tattered remnants of a nightmare. Jack's flashlight beam fell on something glinting amidst the debris, a small, ornate box, its surface untouched by the flames. He knelt to examine it, his hands trembling slightly as he brushed away the ash. The box was intricately carved, its surface adorned with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the light. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized it was the same box he had seen in the photographs from the archives, the one Grins had carried in each of his appearances throughout the decades. Before he could open it, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the ruins. Jack froze, his heart pounding as he turned toward the sound. Grins emerged from the shadows, his painted smile impossibly wide, his eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. "You found my little treasure," the clown said, his voice a rasping whisper that sent chills down Jack's spine. The sheriff raised his rifle, his hand steady as he took aim. "It's over, Grins," he growled, his voice thick with determination. But the clown merely chuckled, his grin stretching wider as he stepped closer. The rifle cracked, the shot echoing through the ruins, but Grins didn't flinch. The bullet passed through him as if he were made of smoke, the sound of his laughter growing louder. "You can't kill me," he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. The sheriff fired again and again, but each shot had no effect. Jack backed away, clutching the box tightly as he searched for an escape. The clown's laughter filled the air, a high-pitched, discordant sound that made Jack's head spin. In a desperate move, Jack pried open the ornate box, revealing a strange amulet nestled inside. It was a twisted, grotesque thing, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols. As he held it, a wave of nausea washed over him, the hum in the air intensifying. Grin's laughter faltered for a moment, his grin faltering as he took a step back. "Put that down," he hissed, his voice laced with a rare note of fear. Jack hesitated, his mind racing as he realized the amulet might be the key to defeating the clown. The sheriff grabbed Jack's arm, his voice urgent. "Whatever you're holding, use it," he shouted, his eyes wide with desperation. Jack nodded, his hands trembling as he clutched the amulet tightly. He focused on the hum, letting it guide him as he raised the amulet toward Grins. The clown's laughter turned to a snarl, his figure flickering like a dying flame as the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. "No!" Grins roared, his voice a guttural scream that shook the ground beneath them. Jack felt a surge of power as the amulet began to glow, its light piercing through the darkness. The symbols on its surface shifted, forming a pattern that seemed to shimmer with otherworldly energy. Grins let out a final, ear-splitting scream as the light enveloped him, his figure dissolving into a cloud of ash that scattered in the wind. The hum in the air ceased, the silence that followed almost deafening. Jack fell to his knees, the amulet slipping from his fingers as he gasped for breath. The sheriff helped him to his feet, his face pale but relieved. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, though a part of him wondered if Grins could ever truly be destroyed. The amulet lay on the ground, its surface now dull and lifeless, the symbols faded into obscurity. Jack picked it up, his hands trembling as he examined it. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was still alive, its connection to Grins not completely severed. As they left the ruins, the townsfolk began to emerge from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and hope. Jack and the sheriff explained what had happened, though they omitted the details of the amulet, fearing it might fall into the wrong hands. The townsfolk listened in stunned silence, their relief tempered by the lingering fear that Grins might return. Jack watched them with a heavy heart, knowing the scars left by the circus would take years to heal. That night, Jack sat alone in his apartment, the amulet laid out before him. Its surface was cold to the touch, the symbols now barely visible. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced. He knew he couldn't keep it, the risk was too great, but he also couldn't destroy it, fearing it might unleash something worse. As he stared at the amulet, a faint hum began to resonate in the air, so soft he could barely hear it. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he realized the truth: the fight wasn't over, and Grins' influence still lingered, waiting for the right moment to return. The days following the confrontation with Grins were marked by an uneasy calm. The town of Millwood began to rebuild, its people cautiously stepping out of the shadows of fear that had gripped them for so long. The scorched remains of the circus grounds were cleared away, the earth turned over as if to bury the horrors it had witnessed. Yet, despite the apparent victory, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The amulet sat in a locked drawer in his apartment, its presence a constant, nagging weight in the back of his mind. He tried to focus on helping the town recover, but the faint hum that occasionally buzzed in his ears reminded him that the battle was far from over. One evening, as Jack sat at his kitchen table, the hum grew louder, a low, persistent vibration that seemed to resonate in his bones. He froze, his fork clattering against his plate as he strained to listen. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a haunting echo of the circus's presence. Jack rose from his seat, his heart pounding as he walked to the drawer where the amulet was kept. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, before finally opening it. The amulet lay inside, its surface dull and lifeless, but as he reached for it, the hum intensified, almost as if it were calling to him. Jack held the amulet in his hand, its cold metal sending a shiver through him. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift faintly, though he couldn't be sure if it was just a trick of the light. He turned it over, examining it closely, but found no obvious clues as to its purpose or origin. The archives had mentioned similar artifacts in towns where the circus had appeared, each of them linked to strange phenomena and disappearances. Jack's mind raced as he considered what to do. He knew he couldn't destroy it, but he also couldn't bear the thought of keeping it. The amulet was a relic of Grin's power, and somehow he felt it still held a connection to the clown. The next morning, Jack sought out Sheriff Thompson, carrying the amulet carefully wrapped in a cloth. The sheriff listened intently as Jack explained his concerns, his expression growing more grim with each word. "If that thing's still connected to Grins, we can't risk keeping it here," the sheriff said finally, his tone heavy with worry. "We need to find a way to break the connection permanently." Jack nodded, but the realization that they had no idea how to do so weighed heavily on him. The archives had offered no clear solutions, and the townsfolk had no knowledge of such things. They were walking blind into a fight they barely understood. They decided to visit Old Man Harker, a reclusive figure who lived on the edge of town and was rumored to have knowledge of the occult. Harker's cabin was nestled in the woods, its windows dark and its porch cluttered with strange trinkets. Jack and the sheriff approached cautiously, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. They knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet forest. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a hunched figure with wild gray hair and piercing eyes. "What do you want?" Harker demanded, his voice raspy and sharp. Jack held out the wrapped amulet, his hands trembling slightly. "We need your help," he said, his voice low but urgent. Harker's eyes narrowed as he took the amulet, unwrapping it with slow, deliberate movements. His expression darkened as he examined it, his fingers tracing the symbols with a mix of reverence and fear. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice a whisper. Jack explained, recounting the events of the past weeks, while Harker listened in silence, his face growing paler with each word. "This is bad," he muttered finally. "Very bad. The connection isn't broken. You've only weakened it." Harker led them into his cabin, the interior dimly lit by flickering candles and cluttered with books, jars, and strange artifacts. He placed the amulet on a wooden table, surrounded by candles arranged in a peculiar pattern. "This amulet is a vessel," he explained, his voice low and grave. "It's tied to the clown's essence, but it's also tied to the circus. As long as it exists, grins can return." Jack and the sheriff exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Harker's words settling over them. "How do we destroy it?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. Harker shook his head. "You can't destroy it, but you can banish it." The old man began to prepare a ritual, gathering herbs, powders, and other ingredients from the shelves. Jack watched in silence, his unease growing as Harker muttered incantations under his breath. The air in the cabin grew heavy, the candles flickering as if caught in an unseen wind. Harker instructed Jack to hold the amulet over a small, ornate bowl filled with a dark liquid. "Focus," he said, his voice sharp. "Focus on breaking the connection. Think of the clown and wish him gone." Jack nodded, his hands trembling as he clutched the amulet. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the image of Grins, his painted smile, his malevolent laughter. As Jack concentrated, the liquid in the bowl began to bubble, a low hiss filling the air. The symbols on the amulet glowed faintly, their light growing brighter as the humming in the room intensified. Jack felt a surge of energy, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to press against him from all sides. He focused harder, his mind filled with the memory of Grins dissolving into ash, the relief of seeing the clown gone. The symbols on the amulet flared one final time before the light faded, the amulet falling silent in his hands. The liquid in the bowl turned black, its surface still and lifeless. Harker leaned back, his face pale and sweat dripping from his brow. "It's done," he said, his voice weak but firm. "The connection is broken." Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his hands shaking as he set the amulet on the table. The sheriff looked relieved but cautious. "What now?" he asked. Harker's eyes narrowed. "Now you bury it, somewhere far from here, where no one will find it. And don't look back." Jack nodded, though a part of him still feared the amulet's lingering power. The next day, Jack and the sheriff drove deep into the woods, far from Millwood. They chose a remote spot, its silence broken only by the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. Jack dug a hole in the soft earth, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed the amulet inside, covering it with dirt and marking the spot with a large, flat stone. Neither of them spoke as they worked, the weight of what they were doing hanging heavy in the air. As they drove back to town, Jack tried to shake the feeling of unease that still clung to him. The amulet was gone, its connection to Grins broken, but he couldn't shake the thought that the clown might return in some other form. The town of Millwood began to heal, its streets slowly coming back to life, but the scars left by the circus would remain for years. Jack returned to his apartment, the space feeling strangely empty without the amulet's presence. He sat at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the town he had fought so hard to protect. That night, as Jack lay in bed, he heard it again, a faint guttural laugh that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He sat up, his heart pounding as he scanned the darkened room. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the air around him. Jack reached for the lamp on his bedside table, turning it on, but the room was empty. The laughter ceased, replaced by a chilling whisper that sent shivers down his spine. "It's never over, Jack. It's never over." The whisper lingered in Jack's mind long after the room fell silent, its chilling echoes haunting him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling as his thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm. The amulet was buried, its connection to Grin's supposedly broken, yet the laughter and whispers persisted, a cruel reminder that their victory might have been only temporary. Jack knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The fight wasn't over, and Grin's, or whatever remained of him, wasn't finished with Millwood. As the first light of dawn crept through his window, Jack resolved to take action, no matter how dangerous it might be. He met Sheriff Thompson early that morning at the town's diner, a small, worn-down place that smelled of stale coffee and grease. The sheriff's face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot, and it was clear he hadn't slept much either. Jack slid into the booth across from him, lowering his voice as he recounted the whispers he had heard. The sheriff listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each word. "If Grin's is still out there," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly, "we need to find him before he finds us." Jack nodded, though the thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. They were walking into the unknown, and the stakes were higher than ever. The two men decided to visit Old Man Harker again, hoping he might have more answers. The cabin in the woods felt even more foreboding than before, its windows dark and the air around it unnaturally still. Harker answered the door with a scowl, his eyes narrowing as he took in their grim expressions. "You're back," he said flatly, his voice tinged with resignation. Jack explained the whispers, the laughter, the growing certainty that Grin's was still out there. Harker sighed deeply, stepping aside to let them in. The cabin was as cluttered as ever, the scent of herbs and dust filling the air. Harker sat at his table, his hands clasped together as he leaned forward. "Breaking the connection was only the first step," he explained, his voice heavy with unease. "Grin's is tied to the circus, but the circus is tied to something deeper, a source of power that exists beyond our understanding. If you want to truly stop him, you'll need to confront that source." Jack and the sheriff exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Harker's words settling over them. "How do we do that?" Jack asked, his voice trembling slightly. Harker's expression darkened. "There's a place," he said slowly, "a place where the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond is thin. It's where the circus began, where Grin's was born." Harker refused to say more, his cryptic warnings leaving Jack and the sheriff with more questions than answers. They left the cabin with a sense of dread, the old man's words echoing in their minds. The rest of the day was spent gathering supplies and preparing for the journey, though neither of them knew exactly what they were preparing for. Jack's apartment became a makeshift war room, maps and notes scattered across the table as they tried to piece together the location Harker had described. The archives offered little help, their records of the circus's origins vague and incomplete. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack and the sheriff set out toward the woods, their backpacks filled with supplies and flashlights strapped to their belts. The forest was quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their boots and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The further they ventured, the heavier the air seemed, the trees closing in around them like sentinels guarding a dark secret. Jack's unease grew with each step, the faint hum of the amulet's power lingering in the back of his mind. After hours of walking, they reached a clearing unlike any they had seen before. The ground was barren, the trees surrounding it twisted and gnarled as if they had been frozen in agony. At the center of the clearing stood a strange, circular structure, a ring of jagged stones etched with symbols that matched those on the amulet. The air around it shimmered faintly, as if the very fabric of reality was being strained. Jack's stomach churned as he approached the stones, the hum in his mind growing louder, more insistent. Sheriff Thompson stayed back, his hand on his rifle as he scanned the clearing for any sign of danger. Jack stepped into the circle, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the hum reached a deafening pitch. The symbols on the stones began to glow, their light casting an eerie, sickly green hue over the clearing. Jack felt a pull, a force dragging him toward the center of the circle, his feet moving almost against his will. He tried to resist, but the force was too strong, the hum consuming his thoughts, his senses. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to give way, and Jack was plunged into darkness. He tumbled through a void, the air around him cold and suffocating, the hum now a deafening roar. He landed hard on a rough, uneven surface, his vision swimming as he struggled to orient himself. The darkness around him was absolute, the air thick with the scent of decay and something metallic. Jack fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the blackness to reveal a nightmarish landscape, twisted, jagged structures, rivers of black ooze, and a sky that pulsed with an unnatural light. He wasn't alone. Figures moved in the shadows, their forms shifting and indistinct, their eyes glowing with malevolent light. Jack's heart pounded as he realized where he was the source of Grin's power, the place Harker had warned them about. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the void, and Jack turned to see Grin step out of the darkness, his painted smile wider than ever, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Welcome, Jack," the clown said, his voice a horrifying blend of amusement and malice. "I've been waiting for you." Jack stumbled backward, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated Grin's grotesque figure. The clown's painted smile seemed to stretch impossibly wide, his eyes glinting with a malevolent light that sent a cold shiver down Jack's spine. The air around them was thick, oppressive, and the hum that had haunted Jack for weeks now roared in his ears like a tidal wave. Grins took a slow step forward, his movements unnaturally fluid, as if he were gliding rather than walking. "You've come a long way to find me," he said, his voice a guttural rasp that echoed through the void. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. The landscape around them was a horrifying distortion of reality. Twisted spires of black rock jutted into the pulsing sky, rivers of dark, oily liquid snaked through the ground, and the air was filled with the faint, distant screams of unseen creatures. Jack felt as though he had stepped into a nightmare, a place where fear and madness reigned supreme. He gripped his flashlight tightly, its beam cutting through the darkness but offering little comfort. Grins took another step forward, his grin widening as he loomed over Jack. "Did you really think you could stop me?" he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. Jack clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand his ground despite the terror clawing at his chest. Before he could respond, the ground beneath him shifted, the jagged rocks trembling as if the very earth were alive. Jack stumbled, his flashlight beam flickering as he tried to steady himself. Grins let out a low, guttural laugh, his eyes narrowing into sinister slits. "This is my domain," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. "Here, I am everything." Jack's mind raced as he tried to process the clown's words. If this place was the source of Grin's power, then destroying it was the only way to stop him for good. But how could he fight in a world where the rules of reality didn't apply? As Jack struggled to gather his thoughts, a faint light caught his eye. It was small, barely visible against the oppressive darkness, but it pulsed with a warm, golden glow that seemed out of place in this horrific landscape. Jack's eyes widened as he recognized it, the amulet, or at least a remnant of its power, glowing faintly in the distance. Grin's grin faltered for a moment, his head snapping toward the light as a low growl escaped his throat. "No," he hissed, his voice laced with anger. "That doesn't belong here." Jack seized the opportunity, forcing himself to move toward the light despite the heavy weight of fear that threatened to paralyze him. Grins lunged forward, his movements swift and predatory, but Jack was faster. He reached the light, his hands closing around the warm, glowing object. As soon as he touched it, a surge of energy coursed through him, the hum in his ears shifting into a powerful, resonant vibration that seemed to fill the air around him. Jack's fear melted away, replaced by a strange sense of clarity and purpose. He turned to face Grins, the light in his hands growing brighter with each passing second. The clown hesitated, his grin faltering as he took a step back. "You can't win," Grin snarled, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. But Jack knew better. With the amulet's power in his hands, Jack felt a surge of determination. He focused on the light, letting it guide him as he stepped toward Grin's. The clown's figure flickered, his form wavering like a flame in the wind as the light grew stronger. "This ends now," Jack said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Grins let out a guttural scream, his painted face contorting with rage as he lunged toward Jack, but the light in Jack's hands flared, a brilliant burst of golden energy that engulfed the clown in its glow. Grin's scream turned into a choked gasp, his figure dissolving into a cloud of black ash that scattered in the wind. The landscape around Jack began to collapse, the twisted spires crumbling into dust and the rivers of black ooze evaporating into nothingness. The pulsating sky above him shattered, fragments of darkness falling away to reveal a deep, endless void. Jack felt himself being pulled upward, the amulet's light carrying him as the world around him disintegrated. The last thing he saw before the void consumed him was the faint outline of Grin's smile, its sinister edges fading into nothingness. Jack awoke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat as he found himself lying on the cold, hard ground of the stone circle in the clearing. The hum was gone. The oppressive weight of Grin's presence lifted. Jack sat up, his hands trembling as he looked around. The symbols on the stones were dull and lifeless, their eerie glow extinguished. The forest around him was quiet, the air crisp and fresh as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. Jack took a deep breath, relief washing over him as he realized he had succeeded. Sheriff Thompson appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face pale but relieved as he rushed to Jack's side. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Jack nodded, though his body ached and his mind was still reeling from the ordeal. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Grins is gone, really gone this time." The sheriff helped him to his feet, his grip firm but gentle as he supported Jack's weakened frame. Together, they made their way back through the woods, the heavy weight of fear and dread finally lifted. The town of Millwood greeted them with cautious optimism, the townsfolk emerging from their homes as word of their return spread. Jack and the sheriff explained what had happened. Their words met with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The scars left by Grins and the circus would take time to heal, but for the first time in months, there was hope. Jack returned to his apartment, his body exhausted but his mind at peace. The amulet was gone, its power used to banish Grins for good, and the whispers and laughter that had haunted him were finally silent. As Jack lay in bed that night, he stared at the ceiling, his thoughts calm for the first time in weeks. He knew the fight had been worth it, but he also knew that the nightmares would linger, a reminder of the horrors he had faced. Still, he felt a sense of closure, a quiet certainty that Millwood would recover and that he had done what needed to be done. The town might never be the same, but it was free, and that was enough. The days that followed were marked by a slow but steady return to normalcy. The townsfolk began to rebuild, their laughter and voices filling the streets once more. Jack watched from his apartment window, a small smile playing on his lips as he saw the town come back to life. Sheriff Thompson visited him often, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced. They didn't speak much about what had happened, but the unspoken understanding between them was enough. One evening, as Jack sat at his kitchen table, he noticed something strange, a faint, golden glow emanating from the drawer where the amulet had once been kept. He opened it cautiously, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the source of the light. It was a small, golden fragment of the amulet, its surface smooth and warm to the touch. Jack stared at it, a mix of curiosity and unease stirring within him. The fragment pulsed softly, its light gentle but persistent. He knew he should get rid of it, but something about it felt different. Jack slid the fragment into his pocket, his mind racing with questions. The fight was over, but the amulet's power still lingered, a faint reminder of the battle they had fought. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew one thing: whatever came next, he would face it head-on. The town of Millwood was safe. and he would do whatever it took to keep it that way. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against his face, Jack felt a quiet sense of hope. The darkness was gone, and for now, that was enough.